Picture yourself standing in the Egyptian desert just before dawn, the air still cool against your skin, the silence so complete you can hear your own heartbeat. Before you rises the Great Pyramid, a mountain of stone built by human hands waiting. Then the sun breaks the horizon, and the first ray of light strikes the pyramid's apex with such precision that you realize immediately this isn't accident. This is mathematics. This is intention. This is something we've been told we understand, but standing here in this moment, you begin to wonder if we've understood anything at all. The Pharaohs, we learned about them in school. Kings of Egypt, builders of monuments. Rulers who wanted to be remembered, who feared death so much they spent fortunes preparing for an afterlife they believed in with the fervour of the deeply religious. That's the story. That's what fills the textbooks and museum placards and documentary narrations. Political leaders, military commanders, administrative heads of state who happen to build really, really big tombs. But something doesn't fit. Why would practical rulers invest 30% of their nation's wealth into structures whose purpose we still can't fully explain? Why align these monuments to stars with precision we've only recently matched with satellite technology? Why fill their so-called tombs with texts describing journeys through dimensions, transformations into light, navigation of realms we've dismissed as primitive mythology? They built monuments we cannot replicate today with all our machinery. They aligned them with stars we're only now beginning to understand. They spoke of journeys to realms that exist. They insisted just beyond the edge of what our senses perceive. They prepared for death not with the resignation of the religious, but with the methodical precision of engineers preparing for a launch sequence. What if everything we've been told about the Pharaohs represents only the surface of a much deeper truth? This isn't about ancient aliens or conspiracy theories. This is about looking at the evidence, the actual stones, the actual alignments, the actual texts, and asking honest questions. Questions that arise when you set aside assumptions and examine what's actually there. Questions that generations of scholars have noticed but often left unasked, because asking them means admitting how much we might not understand. We're about to embark on a journey of discovery, one that requires something difficult, setting aside what we think we know and looking at the Pharaohs with fresh eyes. But first, we need to establish what we've been told. We need to understand the conventional story before we can see what it might be missing. The standard story of the Pharaohs is well established, refined over more than a century of scholarship. It goes like this. They were divine kings, living gods who ruled Egypt through a combination of religious authority, political power, and military might. Each pharaoh was the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, and upon death would become one with Osiris, lord of the afterlife. They commanded armies, administered vast bureaucracies, collected taxes, maintained order, and built monuments to ensure their names would echo through eternity. This framework makes sense. It fits what we know about human nature, about power, about the ego of rulers throughout history. The pharaohs wanted to be remembered. They feared being forgotten. So they built big, they built in stone, they filled their tombs with treasures and their temple walls with inscriptions celebrating their victories, their wisdom, their divine right to rule. The academic machinery supporting this interpretation is impressive. Egyptology emerged in the 19th and early 20th centuries when European scholars first began systematically studying the remnants of this ancient civilization. They brought with them the interpretive tools of their time understanding monarchy through the lens of European kings, understanding imperialism through their own colonial projects, understanding ambition through the framework of political power and posthumous legacy. And they did incredible work. They deciphered hieroglyphics. They catalogued dynasties. They mapped temple complexes and excavated tombs and pieced together 3,000 years of history from fragmentary evidence. This scholarship is real, valuable, foundational. We're not here to dismiss it, but here's where the cracks begin to show. Why would practical, politically minded rulers invest sometimes up to 30% of their nation's resources into tombs and temples if they were merely concerned with earthly power and posthumous fame? That's not just extravagant, that's civilization threatening. Imagine a modern nation spending a third of its entire economy on monuments to its leader. It would collapse within a generation, yet Egypt thrived for 3,000 years doing exactly this. Consider Khufu's Great Pyramid, the most famous monument in Egypt, perhaps in the world. Every textbook calls it a tomb, yet it contained no mummy when modern explorers first entered it. No treasure, no inscriptions identifying it as a burial site, no decorations typical of pharaonic tombs. Just empty chambers, precise angles, and mathematical relationships we're still trying to fully understand. A tomb without a body, a monument without an explanation. Or consider Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who suddenly abandoned Egypt's traditional gods and declared that only the 10th son deserved worship. Orthodox history explains this as political maneuvering, an attempt to consolidate power by undermining the priesthood. But reading Akhenaten's hymns to the Aten, you encounter something that feels less like political strategy and more like genuine philosophical revolution. A shift in consciousness, a glimpse of something beyond the conventional framework. According to our textbooks, these were kings who wanted to be remembered. But what if remembrance was never the point at all? The Orthodox narrative isn't wrong, exactly. It's accurate as far as it goes. The pharaohs did rule Egypt. They did command armies and build monuments and claim divine authority. All of that is true, but truth can have layers. The surface can be accurate while concealing depths beneath. What happens when we look more closely at what doesn't quite fit? When we examine the anomalies that conventional explanations struggle to address? When we take seriously the possibility that we've been interpreting these ancient rulers through frameworks that might be fundamentally incomplete? That's where things get interesting. Let's examine the evidence methodically, piece by piece, the way an investigator approaches a cold case when the official explanation doesn't quite account for all the facts. Start with the architecture. The Great Pyramid contains granite blocks weighing 70 tons transported from quarries 500 miles away. These blocks were somehow lifted to heights of 40 meters and positioned with precision tolerances measured in millimeters. Not inches, millimeters. We're told they used copper tools, wooden sledges, and rope. Perhaps they did. But modern construction companies with hydraulic cranes and computer-guided placement systems classify replicating this feat as theoretically possible but practically unreplicable with current budgets and timelines. Then there's the astronomical precision. Everyone knows about the Orion correlation, the 3 pyramids of Giza aligned to match Orion's belt. But that's just the beginning. Temple after temple orients to specific stellar events with accuracy that requires understanding celestial mechanics we didn't formalize until the 20th century. The Great Pyramid incorporates pi into its dimensions, the ratio of height to base perimeter with accuracy to 3 decimal places. It incorporates phi, the golden ratio, into chamber proportions. Some researchers claim it encodes Earth's polar radius and equatorial circumference when the right multipliers are applied. Coincidence? Perhaps. But how many coincidences does it take before we start calling them patterns? The texts pose their own mysteries. The pyramid texts, carved into 5th and 6th dynasty tombs, don't read like religious poetry or political propaganda. They read like technical manuals, instructions for stellar ascension, descriptions of transformation into light, navigation through dimensions, union with cosmic forces. The sky is cleared for you, the stars are brilliant, you ascend to the sky among the imperishable stars. This isn't metaphor about heaven. This is specific, directional, technical language about going somewhere real. Then there's the technological evidence that makes modern engineers pause. Precision cutting of granite and basalt that shows no tool marks, only polished surfaces meeting at perfect 90-degree angles. Statues weighing hundreds of tons, balanced so perfectly they could be rotated by hand. Drill cores extracted from granite showing feed ratio fast, the drill moved through stone that exceed what our modern diamond-tipped drills achieve. These aren't interpretations. In die. These are measurements. Physical artifacts that exist in museums where anyone can examine them. Here's what matters. These aren't cherry-picked anomalies. These are core features of pharaonic civilization. The things the pharaohs themselves clearly considered most important. They devoted their greatest resources not to palaces or fortresses, but to these precise, astronomically aligned, technologically sophisticated structures whose true purpose remains debated. They achieved engineering feats we classify as theoretically possible, but practically unreplicable. See, they aligned their monuments with astronomical precision to stars we've only mapped in recent decades. Either they were extraordinarily lucky across thousands of years and dozens of construction projects, or they were operating from a knowledge base we haven't yet acknowledged. So here's the question that drives everything that follows. If the pharaohs weren't simply kings seeking earthly power and posthumous fame, what were they? The pyramid texts are the oldest religious writings in human history, carved into the walls of 5th and 6th dynasty pyramids around 4,000 years ago. If you want to understand what the pharaohs actually believed, what they actually thought they were doing, you start here. And what you find isn't what you'd expect from the tombs of political leaders. These texts don't speak of earthly glory. They don't celebrate military victories or administrative achievements. They don't even focus much on the judgment of the dead or moral worthiness. Instead, they speak obsessively, specifically, technically about stars, about transformation into stars, about journeys through something called the Duatha realm between Earth and the imperishable stars, about becoming one with Orion, about sailing the celestial Nile. Listen to the language. The sky is cleared for you. The stars are brilliant. The serpent of the sky is overthrown. You ascend to the sky among the imperishable stars. This isn't the language of burial rites. This is the language of a launch sequence. Instructions, directions, a navigational manual for a journey they believed was absolutely real. The entire theology of pharaonic kingship was structured around stellar ascension. The pharaoh wasn't meant to rule Egypt forever. That was never the goal. The earthly reign was a preparation phase, a training period, a time to develop whatever capabilities or knowledge would be needed for what came next, joining the circumpolar stars, those stars that never set, that wheel eternally around the celestial pole. And they built accordingly. The Great Pyramid contains narrow shafts running from the king's chamber and queen's chamber at precise angles through the massive stone structure. For years, archaeologists called them air shafts, though that never made much sense for a sealed tomb. Modern astronomy has revealed what they actually are, stellar sighting tubes. The southern shaft from the king's chamber points to where Orion's belt would have been visible at the time of construction. The southern shaft from the queen's chamber aligns with Sirius the star, the Egyptians associated with Isis, sister and wife of Osiris, whose constellation form was Orion. The precision is measured in arc minutes, fractions of a degree. This isn't approximate. This isn't close enough. This is exact. Then there's the Giza Plateau itself. 3 pyramids, decreasing slightly in size, positioned in a pattern that precisely mirrors the 3 stars of Orion's belt, including the slight offset of the smallest pyramid, matching the slight offset of the dimmest star. Some researchers claim this alignment represents Orion's position not in the 4th dynasty when the pyramids were built, but thousands of years earlier, around 10,500 BCE, during the previous precessional cycle. But here's what's truly fascinating. The Duat, that realm the pyramid text describes so specifically, might not be mythological at all. In unpolluted ancient skies, the Milky Way appears as a river of stars crossing the heavens, the celestial Nile. And cutting through it is a dark rift, a lane of cosmic dust that creates what looks like a passage, a pathway, a portal. The Egyptians seem to understand this dark rift as the entrance to the Duat, a specific astronomical region, a real location in the cosmos. What if the pharaohs weren't kings playing at religion? What if they were priest astronomers engaged in a project we fundamentally misunderstood, one connected to cosmic cycles, stellar mechanics, perhaps even the slow wobble of Earth's axis we call precession? How did they acquire such precise astronomical knowledge without modern instruments? Numbers don't lie. They can be interpreted differently, their significance debated, but the numbers themselves remain constant, verifiable, immune to the shifting winds of theory and interpretation. So let's look at the numbers encoded in the Great Pyramid. The original height before the outer casing stones were removed was 481 feet. Multiply that by 43,200 and you get the polar radius of Earth. The base perimeter measures 3,023 feet. Multiply that by the same number, 43,200, you get Earth's equatorial circumference. The ratio of the pyramid's height to its base perimeter works out to exactly 2 pi, accurate to within 0.05%. The Great Pyramid encodes Earth's dimensions with precision we didn't achieve until satellite measurements in the 1950s. The Egyptians had no satellites, so how did they know? Maybe they didn't. Maybe these are coincidences, numbers that happen to align because there are only so many ratios you can create with a 4-sided structure, and eventually some will match Earth's geometry by pure chance. That's the safe explanation, the comfortable one. But then you find phi. Phi, the golden ratio, appears throughout nature, in nautilus shells, in flower petals, in the proportions of the human body. It's approximately 1.618, an irrational number that goes on forever without repeating. The ancient Greeks studied it. Renaissance artists used it deliberately, and it appears everywhere in Egyptian architecture. The king's chamber in the Great Pyramid has dimensions that relate to each other through phi. Temple complexes at Karnak and Luxor incorporate phi ratios in their ground plans. Statuary from the Old Kingdom shows facial proportions based on phi relationships. Over and over, in structure after structure, this ratio appears with consistency that makes coincidence seem increasingly unlikely. Then there's the cubit, the Egyptian unit of measurement. For years, archaeologists treated it as arbitrary, just another ancient measurement system. But analysis suggests the royal cubit Thay standard used in pyramid construction equals 1/10,000,000th of Earth's polar radius. Not approximately, equals. As if the measurement system itself was derived from knowing Earth's actual dimensions and working backward to create a unit of length that encoded that knowledge. The geometric sophistication goes deeper still. Temple complexes align to cardinal directions with precision exceeding 1/10 of a degree. Perfect squares and circles appear in architectural plans executed in stone with tolerances we measure in millimeters. There's evidence of understanding geometric sequences, each element related to the next through consistent ratios. Evidence of harmonic proportions, mathematical relationships that create resonance and balance. Evidence of grasping square roots and trigonometric relationships that supposedly weren't formalized until Greek mathematics thousands of years later. What becomes clear is that the pharaohs didn't view mathematics as mere practical calculation addition for accounting, geometry for construction. They seem to understand it as sacred geometry, numbers as expressions of cosmic order, mathematical relationships as reflections of divine harmony, the fundamental structure of reality itself. This connects to Ma'at, the Egyptian concept usually translated as truth, justice, or cosmic order. We think of Ma'at as an ethical principle: speak truth, act justly, maintain balance. But what if Ma'at was also mathematical? What if cosmic order to the Egyptians meant precise relationships, harmonious ratios, geometric perfection? What if they believed that certain numbers, certain proportions, certain angles weren't just aesthetically pleasing, but were literally expressions of how reality is organized at its deepest level? If that's true, then the monuments aren't just buildings. They're texts, mathematical texts encoded in stone, information preserved in ratio, angle, and dimension. Knowledge that survives when papyrus crumbles, when libraries burn, when civilizations fall and languages are forgotten. Stone endures, numbers endure, relationships between measurements endure. Which raises the question, if the pharaohs possessed this level of mathematical and astronomical knowledge, if they went to such lengths to encode it into monuments designed to last forever, what exactly were they trying to preserve? What knowledge did they consider so crucial that it had to survive the end of their world? Egyptian texts speak constantly of Zep Tepithi, first time, a golden age when gods walked the earth, when civilization was established, when knowledge was given to humanity. Standard scholarship interprets this as creation mythology, the kind of story every culture tells about its origins. A mythological past that never actually existed, serving only to legitimize present authority. But what if it's memory? The king lists are among the most puzzling documents from ancient Egypt. The Palermo stone, the Turin papyrus, these fragmentary records attempt to catalogue every ruler of Egypt from the beginning. And they do record the historical pharaohs we know with reign lengths that match other evidence. Khufu ruled 23 years. Khafre ruled 26 years. Human lifespans verifiable through multiple sources. But before the first dynasty, before the historical record begins around 3100 BCE, these same lists record something else entirely. Dynasties of gods, dynasties of demigods, rulers with names like Ta, Ra, Thoth, Horus, and their reign lengths aren't measured in decades. They're measured in thousands of years. 3,000 years. 9,000 years. Numbers that make no sense if we're talking about human rulers. Traditional Egyptology dismisses this as mythology contaminating historical record. The priests confused their religious stories with actual chronology. They inserted their gods into the king list where they didn't belong. But here's what's interesting. The Egyptians didn't seem confused. They kept these records separately. They knew the difference between mythological time and historical time, between gods and human rulers. Yet they insisted both belonged in the chronology. They claimed the first time happened. They claimed the god-kings ruled. They claimed this wasn't metaphor. Egyptian priests told Greek historians that their records stretched back 36,000 years. The Greeks thought them boastful. Modern scholars think them delusional. But what if they were simply accurate? Consider the architectural evidence. At Abydos stands the Osirion, a massive megalithic structure built with limestone and granite blocks weighing hundreds of tons, fitted together without mortar, using architectural techniques that appear nowhere else in dynastic Egypt. The style is utterly different from typical Egyptian. Construction simpler, more massive, more primitive in some ways, yet more sophisticated in others. And here's the thing, this structure sits beneath a New Kingdom temple built by Seti I around 1300 BCE. The temple is beautiful, refined, covered in intricate hieroglyphics and painted reliefs. The Osirion underneath it is stark, almost brutal in its simplicity, yet built with a level of megalithic engineering that the New Kingdom couldn't match. Which came first? Orthodox chronology says Seti built both. But that makes no sense architecturally. It's like finding a steel-framed skyscraper underneath a wooden barn. Then there's the Sphinx. Standard dating places its construction around 2500 BCE, carved by Khafre of the 4th dynasty. But the Sphinx shows weathering patterns inconsistent with wind erosion. It shows deep vertical fissures, the kind created by heavy rainfall over extended periods. Egypt hasn't had that kind of rainfall in recorded history. The last time the Giza Plateau experienced the climate wet enough to create that erosion was somewhere between 7,000 and 5,000 BCE during the African humid period when the Sahara was green. If the Sphinx weathering is from rainfall, it's thousands of years older than we've assumed, which raises an uncomfortable question: who carved it? And here's what makes all this more mysterious. Egyptian civilization appears suddenly, around 3100 BCE, essentially fully formed. Hieroglyphic writing, monumental architecture, sophisticated art, complex theology, administrative systems, astronomical knowledge, all there in the early dynastic period with minimal evidence of gradual development. Most civilizations show centuries of evolution, experimentation, increasing complexity. Egypt seems to skip that phase. It begins sophisticated, unless it didn't begin there at all, unless it was already old when our history says it started. Look at how the pharaohs described themselves, not as innovators, not as creators, as restorers, as maintainers, as those who renewed the monuments. Inscription after inscription describes pharaohs restoring ancient temples, renewing old traditions, maintaining what had been established in the first time. They spent enormous resources not on creating new architectural forms, but on perfecting specific, established designs. The pyramid form appears suddenly in the 3rd dynasty with Djoser's step pyramid, then reaches geometrical perfection within a century. No experimentation, no evolution, just sudden mastery. The House of Life temples functioned as libraries and schools where priest initiates studied ancient texts. Classical sources describe vast repositories of knowledge, scrolls containing wisdom from the first time. Herodotus, visiting Egypt in the 5th century BCE, wrote of priests showing him records going back thousands of years. Manetho, the Egyptian priest who wrote a history of Egypt for the Greeks, claimed access to temple archives containing knowledge from before the flood. Plato described Egyptian priests possessing astronomical records of extraordinary age. Here's what that astronomical knowledge might indicate. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, takes 25,920 years to complete a full cycle. To track this requires either continuous observation spanning millennia or inherited knowledge from those who made such observations. The Egyptians demonstrated awareness of precession. They understood that the zodiacal ages shift backward through time. They seemed to grasp that they lived in a specific cosmic epoch, fundamentally different from previous epochs and future ones. What if the pharaohs understood themselves not as the beginning, but as the middle? Not as originators of wisdom, but as inheritors. Not as creators of monuments, but as maintainers of structures built by predecessors whose names were forgotten, but whose knowledge remained encoded in stone. What if they saw themselves as custodians of an archive, guardians of knowledge from a previous world, responsible for preserving and transmitting information across the catastrophic gap of civilizational collapse? If that's true, we have to ask, what were they trying to preserve? What knowledge did they consider so crucial that it justified millennia of effort, the investment of civilizational wealth, the construction of monuments designed to outlast kingdoms and epochs? What were they trying to tell us? Consider the scale of what ancient Egypt devoted to death. Not just wealth, though the financial investment was staggering, sometimes 30% of the state treasury directed toward funerary preparations. Not just time, though pyramid construction could span decades, outlasting the pharaoh who commissioned it. Not just labour, though tens of thousands of workers spent their lives cutting stone, moving blocks, carving chambers deep into bedrock. Consider the intellectual investment. Vast priesthoods dedicated solely to funerary ritual. Temple complexes functioning as schools for death preparation. Libraries containing hundreds of text instruction manuals, formulae, sequences of words and actions that had to be performed with absolute precision. Generation after generation of Egypt's brightest minds focused on a single question: what happens at death and how do we navigate it successfully? If this was simply about ensuring comfort in an imagined afterlife, the scale seems absurd. If this were just religious belief, just hoping for heavenly reward, why the obsessive precision? Why the mathematical exactitude? Why treat death preparation with the rigor of engineering? What if the Egyptians understood something we've forgotten? What if death to them wasn't an end, but a transition, and transitions can be navigated badly or well, with preparation or without, with knowledge or in ignorance? Look at mummification not as preservation but as technology. The process wasn't arbitrary. It followed exact protocols refined over centuries. Specific organs removed: lungs, liver, stomach, intestines, each placed in canopic jars aligned to cardinal directions. The heart deliberately preserved inside the body. The brain removed and discarded. Why this pattern? Why these choices? The process took 70 days. Not 69, not 71. 70, the same duration as Sirius disappears from the sky before its heliacal rising, the event that marked the Egyptian New Year and the flooding of the Nile. Coincidence? Or deliberate correlation with celestial cycles? The substances used went far beyond simple preservation. Natron for desiccation, yes, but also resins with antibacterial properties we're only now understanding. Oils whose chemical composition suggests purposes we can't quite identify. Body positioned in cardinal alignment, head to the north, echoing the orientation of pyramid chambers. Specific amulets placed at specific locations on the body, throat, heart, solar plexus positions that correspond to what other traditions call energy centers. The texts themselves read like technical manuals once you set aside the assumption that they're merely religious poetry. The Book of the Dead, the coffin texts, the earlier pyramid texts, they contain specific instructions. Precise formulas, exact sequences. I know the name of this guardian. I speak the word of power. The gate opens, not metaphor, procedure. Then there's the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid. Empty when modern explorers found it. No mummy, no treasure. Just a granite box, unfinished, its lid never placed. Conventional archaeology calls it a sarcophagus, a tomb that somehow never got used. But what if it wasn't a tomb at all? The chamber is built entirely of granite, a crystalline stone with piezoelectric properties that generates electrical charge under pressure. The dimensions create specific resonant frequencies. Modern acoustical analysis reveals something remarkable. The chamber naturally produces infrasound, frequencies below the threshold of human hearing, but capable of affecting consciousness, neural activity, even cellular vibration. Stand in that chamber, and your body becomes a resonator. Speak, and the sound doesn't just echo, it amplifies, sustained by the geometry, reinforced by the stone's properties. The effect is visceral, physical, unmistakable. This isn't a room designed for burial. This is a room designed to do something to whoever enters it. What if the pyramids weren't tombs at all? What if they were machines' precision instruments designed to facilitate transformation? And what if death to the Egyptians wasn't an end but an operation, a procedure that could be prepared for, optimized, guided towards successful outcomes through exact technological and ritual processes? What if they understood consciousness as something that could be systematically altered, prepared, transformed and directed not through faith or hope, but through knowledge, precision and technique? If that's true, if they developed transformation technology requiring such exactitude, such preparation, such depth of understanding, they would have needed extensive training systems. You don't operate complex machinery without instruction. You don't navigate unknown territory without maps. You don't attempt transformation without preparation, which raises the question, how did they train? The Greeks called them the house of life per Ankh in Egyptian. These weren't simple temples. They were schools, academies, training centers where selected individuals underwent preparation that could span decades. The curriculum was vast: astronomy, mathematics, medicine, ritual practice, the interpretation of sacred texts. But beneath the surface subjects there seemed to be something else being taught, something the Egyptians considered more fundamental than any technical skill. Pythagoras, who we remember as the father of Western mathematics and philosophy, spent 22 years studying in Egyptian mystery schools before the priests considered him ready to receive their deepest teachings. 22 years. Not months, not a few years of study followed by graduation. 2 decades of preparation before he was deemed qualified to approach the inner mysteries. What could possibly require 22 years to learn? Plato travelled to Egypt and wrote afterward about initiation practices he'd witnessed, though he remained frustratingly vague about specifics. Herodotus, that obsessive recorder of everything he saw in his travels, wrote about Egyptian rites and then added, almost apologetically, that he'd been sworn to secrecy about what he'd witnessed in the temple sanctuaries. He couldn't reveal what he'd seen, or perhaps he couldn't find words adequate to describe it. The system was graded, structured like ascending levels of a pyramid. Outer courts where basic knowledge was taught: astronomy, mathematics, healing arts. These were accessible to priests, to nobility, to anyone with sufficient education and social standing. The knowledge at this level was already sophisticated, already impressive by ancient world standards. But it was only the beginning. Intermediate levels revealed deeper wisdom, not just how to calculate celestial movements, but why those movements mattered. Not just how to prepare the body for burial, but what consciousness does at the moment of death. Not just the names of the gods, but what those names actually represented. Forces, principles, states of being. Then there were the inner sanctuaries, the final initiations. And here, the historical record becomes fragmentary, tantalizing, maddeningly incomplete. We have references to prolonged periods in underground chambers, complete darkness, complete silence, sensory deprivation extending for days, references to specific substances ingested at specific time, substances whose botanical identity we can sometimes guess at, whose effects we can only imagine, references to ritual sequences designed to induce what the texts call the opening of the inner eye, states of consciousness where the initiate perceived realities normally invisible. Mathematical and geometric meditations appear in the fragmentary texts, not just studying geometry but using geometric forms as tools for altering consciousness, staring at specific patterns, visualizing perfect shapes, holding complex mathematical relationships in mind until something shifted, until perception changed, until the initiate experienced what the texts describe as seeing with the heart rather than the eyes. Stellar observations conducted not just to track celestial movements but in specific mental states at specific times, as if the observation itself was a practice, a technique, a method for achieving something beyond mere astronomical knowledge. Look at the architecture of temples like Seti I's monument at Abydos. You enter through massive public courtyards where anyone could stand, then through progressively restricted space, each hall smaller, each chamber more exclusive, ceilings lower, the light dims, until finally you reach the innermost sanctum, a small space deep in the temple's heart where only the highest priests could enter. It's a physical journey that mirrors an initiatory progression, a journey inward, a journey toward whatever mystery lay at the center. And the Pharaoh represented the ultimate initiate, the one who had successfully completed all levels, mastered all teachings, attained the knowledge and capability necessary for the stellar journey the pyramid texts describe. This explains why coronation rituals seem to reenact death and resurrection. The new pharaoh had to symbolically die and be reborn, had to complete the transformation before actually dying, had to demonstrate readiness for what would come. What we call Egyptian religion might have been something more complex, a multi-tiered system. Exoteric mythology for the general population, stories about gods, moral lessons, explanations for natural phenomena. Intermediate wisdom for priests and nobility, deeper understanding of cosmology, consciousness, the structure of reality, and ultimate knowledge reserved for pharaohs, and the highest initiate's knowledge we can only guess at from fragmentary references and cryptic texts. Knowledge perhaps related to consciousness itself, to what it is, what it can become, where it can go, how to navigate spaces that don't appear on any physical map. So what exactly were these initiations designed to produce? What knowledge, what capabilities, what transformations were 22 years of training supposed to achieve? The Egyptians didn't believe humans had one body. They described multiple bodies, multiple aspects of existence, each with its own properties and functions. The Kat, their physical body, the flesh and bone we can touch, the Kaya vital double, an energetic duplicate that sustained life, the Bay personality, mobile consciousness, often depicted as a bird with a human head, the Ak, the transfigured spirit, a being of light, the Sahuthe spiritual body, incorruptible and eternal. Mainstream scholarship treats these as religious metaphor, poetic ways of describing abstract concepts about soul and spirit. But read the text closely and something else emerges. These descriptions read less like metaphor and more like taxonomy, a classification system, a map of different aspects of existence that the Egyptians claimed were as real as the physical body, just operating at different levels of manifestation. What if they were describing dimensions? Modern physics tells us that reality might have 10 or 11 dimensions, most of which we cannot perceive directly. We experience 3 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension, but mathematics suggests others exist, curled up at scales too small to observe or operating in ways our senses can't detect. Egyptian texts describe navigating through 7 gates, 12 divisions, multiple dimensional states. Coincidence or convergent understanding expressed in different language? Consider the duat, that realm the pyramid texts describe so precisely. Not heaven, not hell, not the generic afterlife of later religious traditions. The duat was specifica, between realm, a transition space between physical existence and whatever lay beyond. The texts describe it with navigational detail. There are gates you must pass through, guardians at each gate who must be addressed by their secret names, dangerous regions where hostile forces dwell, transformations you must undergo to progress further. This reads like a manual for navigating actual territory, not imagined mythology. The Book of the Dead provides even more detail. Specific formulas to speak at specific moments, specific amulets to carry for protection, specific knowledge required to pass specific challenges. I know the name of this ferryman. I know the name of his boat. I know the name of the river. Knowledge as technology. Words as tools. Names as keys that open doors. The Egyptians seemed to understand that material reality, the physical world we perceive with physical senses, represented the densest level of a spectrum, the most solid, the most fixed, the most limited. But consciousness could access progressively subtle levels through meditation, through ritual, through altered states deliberately induced, and at death, consciousness transitioned naturally from the physical realm to these subtler dimensions. This wasn't metaphorical to them. The evidence suggests they took it absolutely literally. They invested massive resources preparing the physical body because they believed it remained connected to the other bodies, the other aspects of existence. They aligned death chambers to specific stars because those alignments opened paths, created connections, facilitated navigation to stellar realms. They created detailed instruction texts because navigation required knowledge, preparation, skilly you could do it badly, get lost, fail to reach your destination. Death, in this framework, wasn't cessation. It was dimensional transition from Ka-dominated existence, physical, material, limited 2K existence, then bar existence, then arc existence, each level subtler, each level requiring different navigation skills, each level offering different experiences and possibilities. The ultimate goal was stellar existence, becoming one with the imperishable stars, the circumpolar constellations that wheel eternally around the celestial pole. The ritual technologies they developed supported this navigation. Protective amulets weren't superstitious charms, but devices attuned to specific frequencies, specific dimensions. Words of power weren't magic spells, but precise vibrational formulas. Geometric symbols weren't decoration, but maps, diagrams, operational instructions. Timing aligned to celestial positions mattered because dimensional access points opened and closed according to cosmic cycles. If the pharaohs truly understood multidimensional reality, if they developed working technology for navigating it, if they considered this knowledge crucial enough to preserve across millennia, where would they encode it? In their most important monuments, in structures designed to last forever, to communicate across the collapse of civilizations, to speak to future humans who might finally possess the tools to decode what had been preserved in stone. Papyrus lasts a few centuries in ideal conditions before it crumbles. Oral traditions distort within generations, stories change, details shift, meanings drift, even carved inscriptions erode, weather become illegible. But stone architecture, if designed with sufficient mass and precision, can preserve information for millennia, not just survive, but actively communicate across the vast gulf of time. What if that's exactly what the pharaohs intended? Think of the Great Pyramid as an information storage device. Its dimensions encode Earth's polar radius and equatorial circumference through specific mathematical relationships. Its angles incorporate pi and phi, mathematical constants that appear throughout nature and optimal design. Its orientation marks true north with precision that exceeds most modern buildings, accurate to within 3/60ths of a single degree, a tolerance that requires sophisticated surveying and astronomical observation. The internal chambers and passages align to stellar positions, but not just any positions. They mark alignments that repeat only after vast cycles of precession, the 26,000-year wobble of Earth's axis. Whoever designed this structure was thinking in terms of deep time, cosmic cycles, information that needed to survive, not just dynasties or kingdoms, but entire epochs of human civilization. And here's what makes it brilliant: architectural redundancy. The same information encoded multiple ways throughout the structure. Earth's dimensions appear in the overall proportions, but also in the ratios between chambers, in the angles of passages, in the relationships between different structural elements. If part of the monument is damaged, if future investigators can only measure certain features, the information remains accessible through other pathways. This is how you design a message meant to survive catastrophe. Look at the geometric language that appears throughout Egyptian architecture. Phi, the golden ratio, shows up in temple ground plans, in chamber dimensions, in the proportions of statuary. Pi appears in the relationship between heights and perimeters. Sacred triangles, 3, 4, 5 right triangles, the same geometry Pythagoras would later formalize, form the basis of pyramid slopes and architectural layouts. These aren't decorative choices. These are encoding schemes. Ways to preserve mathematical knowledge in the physical structure itself. Temple complexes like Karnak function as three-dimensional astronomical texts. The main processional way aligns to the winter solstice. Side temples mark equinoxes. Chamber orientations track stellar risings. Wall reliefs don't just depict gods and pharaohs, they show stellar maps, celestial positions, astronomical events. The spacing between pillars encodes musical harmonics, the same ratios that create pleasing sounds, also creating harmonious proportions in stone. Walk through these temples with understanding of what you're seeing, and you're reading a book, a library, an encyclopedia encoded in architecture. Modern researchers keep finding correlations that seem impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The Great Pyramid's latitude are measured in modern degrees, minutes, and decimal seconds reads 29.2792,458 degrees north. The speed of light, measured in meters per second, is 299,792,758. The same number sequence, different units but the same relationship. Coincidence? Maybe, but how many times can you say coincidence before pattern becomes apparent? Earth's dimensions encoded with satellite-level precision. Precession cycles marked in stellar alignments, stellar distances potentially indicated through geometric relationships, mathematical constants incorporated into structural design, Waras, all of it preserved in 2 million tons of precisely fitted stone. This isn't numerology. Numerology is finding patterns by cherry-picking data and applying flexible interpretation. This is finding the same specific relationships appearing in multiple structures, built over centuries, using consistent encoding methods. This is information architecture at a scale we're only beginning to appreciate. But why? Why go to such extraordinary lengths to encode knowledge in monuments? Because the Egyptians remembered. Their texts speak of previous destructions. The Edfu temple texts describe the reconstruction of sacred sites after a great catastrophe. The pyramid texts reference a time before time when the world had to be remade. They understood that civilizations fall, that knowledge can be lost, that what one generation considers obvious, another generation might not even imagine. They understood cyclical cosmic catastrophes, whether literal or metaphorical. They grasped that human civilization faces periodic resets, and they were determined that essential knowledge would survive those resets, would persist through the dark ages between one flowering of human civilization and the next. So they built in stone, They encoded knowledge multiple ways. They created monuments designed to outlast not just their own civilization, but the collapse that they seemed to know would eventually come. What if the pyramids aren't what they left behind, but what they left for us? Messages in stone waiting for a civilization advanced enough to decode them. Not ancient history, but ancient future planning. Time capsules designed to be opened when humanity finally develops the mathematical sophistication, the astronomical knowledge, the measurement precision necessary to read what was written in dimension and angle and astronomical alignment. We might be that civilization. We might be the intended recipients, finally equipped to receive messages sent across 4,000 years of time. But what specific information were they trying to preserve? The Temple of Dendera, built during the Ptolemaic period but standing on foundations far older, contains one of the most enigmatic artifacts from ancient Egypt. On the ceiling of a side chapel carved in stone is a circular zodiac. Not just the 12 familiar constellations, but a complete celestial map showing the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of stars to shift gradually over time. One complete precessional cycle takes 25,920 years. More than 1,000 generations. The Dendera zodiac shows this complete cycle, mapped with understanding that suggests either millennia of continuous observation or inherited knowledge from those who made such observations. How did a civilization supposedly limited to naked eye observation track a cycle that takes 1,000 generations to complete? The Giza pyramid complex itself appears designed to mark specific moments in precessional time. The three pyramids align to Orion's belt, but not to Orion's position in the 4th dynasty when Orthodox chronology says they were built. They align to Orion's position at its lowest point in the precessional cycle, around 10,500 BCE. Some researchers argue this represents the actual construction date. Others suggest the alignment commemorates an earlier epoch, marking a specific moment in cosmic time that held significance the pharaohs wanted preserved. The Sphinx gazes eternally eastward, watching the sunrise at the spring equinox. Currently, it watches the sun rise in Pisces, but during the age of literally 10,000 to 8,000 BCE, it would have watched the sun rise in its own constellation. A lion monument facing the constellation of the lion at the spring equinox. Memory in stone of a specific cosmic moment. Solar cycles embed themselves throughout temple architecture with precision that takes your breath away when you witness it. At Abu Simbel, twice each year, sunlight penetrates the temple's entire length, 60 meters through increasingly narrow passages, illuminate 4 statues in the innermost sanctuary. These solar events occur within days of the pharaoh's birthday and coronation. Not approximately. The alignment achieves precision measured in minutes of arc. The Karnak complex aligns its main axis to the winter solstice sunrise. Stand at the temple's heart on the shortest day of the year, and the first light of dawn travels the entire processional way, illuminating sanctuary after sanctuary in sequence. This alignment has held for more than 3,000 years, despite Earth's axial precession gradually shifting stellar and solar positions. The Egyptians tracked the Sothic cycle 1460 years between synchronizations of the calendar year, the solar year, and Sirius's heliacal rising. This requires astronomical observation precise enough to detect small discrepancies accumulating over centuries, mathematical sophistication to calculate the full cycle length, and institutional continuity to maintain records across time spans longer than most civilizations exist. Lunar cycles appear in temple proportions and ritual timing. The Metonic cyclenine, years after which moon phases repeat on the same calendar, dates governs festival scheduling and architectural ratios. This knowledge, supposedly discovered by the Greek astronomer Meton in the 5th century BCE, appears in Egyptian monuments built 1,000 years earlier. But here's what truly challenges conventional understanding. Tracking precession requires either continuous observation spanning thousands of years or mathematical modelling of Earth's axial wobble. The Egyptians had neither modern instruments nor, we're told, the mathematical frameworks necessary for such modelling. Yet they demonstrated knowledge of precession. They marked it in monuments. They incorporated it into their cosmic calendar. The practical applications are obvious. Agricultural timing depends on accurate calendars. Nile flood prediction requires understanding solar and stellar cycles. Navigation benefits from precise astronomical knowledge. These alone would justify sophisticated observation and calculation. but the Egyptians seemed interested in something beyond practical application. They tracked cosmic cycles that exceeded any practical time frame. They marked processional moments separated by thousands of years. They built monuments encoding astronomical knowledge whose utility wouldn't become apparent for millennia. Why? What drove this obsession with cosmic time? Egyptian texts speak of cosmic renewal, of vast cycles of destruction and regeneration. They describe the universe moving through ages, each with different conditions, different possibilities, different challenges. They suggest that tracking these cycles wasn't academic curiosity but survival necessity, that knowing where you stand in cosmic time helps navigate what's coming. That understanding your place in the vast wheel of cosmic cycles isn't philosophical abstraction, but practical wisdom. That civilizations rise and fall according to patterns larger than human politics or military might. That the universe itself breathes in cycles, and those who understand the rhythm survive what others don't even see approaching. This astronomical knowledge wasn't separate from their understanding of cosmic order. It was the foundation of it. Ma'at. The word appears in nearly every Egyptian text of significance, usually translated as truth, justice, or order. Egyptologists explain it as moral philosophy, the ethical foundation of Egyptian society. Be truthful, act justly, maintain balance. Good advice, certainly, but reading the texts more carefully, something deeper emerges. Ma wasn't abstract philosophy to the Egyptians. It was cosmic principle, physical law, the fundamental structure of reality itself. The universe, they understood, naturally tends toward isfet chaos, disorder, dissolution. Left alone, things fall apart. Structures collapse. Organization degrades. Energy dissipates. What we now call entropy, they called isfet. And opposing this universal tendency toward chaos required conscious effort, directed intention, continuous work. They didn't call the pharaoh a king. They called him the one who maintains Ma'at cosmic order. What if that wasn't a title but a job description, and the job was literally holding reality together? Look at how this responsibility manifested. Pharaoh performed specific rituals at specific times, determined by astronomical observation, not occasionally, daily. These weren't ceremonial gestures or symbolic acts. The texts describe them as maintaining the universe, as necessary work that couldn't be neglected without consequences. Sacred sites required continuous maintenance. Alignments had to be checked and preserved. As stone settled, as Earth's crust shifted microscopically, as precession gradually altered stellar positions, adjustments had to be made. Someone had to ensure that the architectural relationships, the geometric proportions, the astronomical correspondences remained accurate across centuries. The pharaoh patronized knowledge, system schools of astronomy, mathematics, medicine, architecture, not as luxury or cultural refinement, but as essential infrastructure. Knowledge preservation was cosmic maintenance. Standards had to be maintained: the exact length of the royal cubit, the precise ratios for temple construction, the correct astronomical calculations. These couldn't be allowed to drift, to degrade, to become approximate. Modern physics is only now formalizing what the Egyptians seemed to understand intuitively. The universe tends toward entropy, toward maximum disorder. Localized regions of high organized living systems like consciousness, like civilization exist in defiance of this tendency. They require constant energy input, constant information processing, constant maintenance. Pharaoh, in this framework, wasn't a political leader managing a kingdom. He was a cosmic engineer maintaining an ordered system within a chaotic universe. Egypt itself was the system, its architectural alignments, its ritual cycles, its knowledge preservation, its social structures, all working together to maintain a pocket of high organization, a node of cosmic order in a universe trending toward dissolution. The Sed festival, celebrated after 30 years of rule and then at intervals thereafter, involved symbolic death and resurrection of the pharaoh. He was renewed, regenerated, his capacity to maintain Ma'at restored. This wasn't metaphorical. The festival included specific rituals, specific performances, specific demonstrations that the pharaoh still possessed the capability, the knowledge, the power to perform his cosmic function. Daily temple rituals followed precise sequences. The god had to be awakened. Offerings had to be presented. Specific words had to be spoken. Specific actions performed in specific order. The texts describe this as maintaining the universe, keeping the cosmic machinery running, preventing dissolution back into primordial chaos. The enormous effort devoted to maintaining precise measurements and alignments makes sense only if you understand them as functionally necessary, not merely symbolically important. If certain geometries, certain proportions, certain alignments actually do something, create conditions, enable processes, facilitate transformations, then maintaining them precisely becomes practical necessity, not religious obsession. Consider the possibility that consciousness itself requires specific environmental conditions, that achieving or maintaining transformed states depends on specific geometries, specific materials, specific energetic patterns, that the monuments weren't just symbols of cosmic order, but actual instruments maintaining that order, generating conditions necessary for consciousness to operate at levels beyond the ordinary. This reframes everything. The pyramids aren't tombs or even just information storage. They're maintenance equipment. The temples aren't just ritual spaces but operational facilities. The pharaoh isn't a ruler but an operator, someone trained to use these instruments, to perform the procedures, to maintain the system. And if that system required such precision, such knowledge, such continuous effort to maintain, what happens when it fails? What happens when the knowledge is lost, when the trained operators die without adequate successes, when the monuments fall into disrepair, when the measurements drift, when the rituals are performed incorrectly or not at all? What happens when Ma'at breaks down and Isfet returns? Something changed after the Old Kingdom, not suddenly, not catastrophically at first, but if you trace Egyptian civilization across its 3,000-year span, you notice a pattern. The earliest periods show innovation, mastery, confidence. The later periods show imitation, approximation, uncertainty. The Pyramid Age ended around 2200 BCE. After that, pharaohs stopped building pyramids, not entirely, but the scale diminished, the precision degraded, the ambition contracted. The New Kingdom pharaohs, ruling 1,000 years later, chose valley tombs instead. Chambers carved into cliffs, hidden behind rockfalls, sealed with rubble. Still elaborate, still filled with treasure and texts, but fundamentally different from the massive, precisely engineered, astronomically aligned monuments of the Old Kingdom. Was this architectural evolution, or was it loss? Did they choose valley tombs, or could they no longer build pyramids? Look at the evidence of technological regression. Late period temples use smaller stones, fitted with less precision. The enormous granite and limestone blocks of earlier period 70 tons, 100 tons, positioned with millimetre tolerances, these disappear from later construction. Temple walls from the late period increasingly show inscriptions copied from earlier monuments rather than original compositions. The same texts, the same formulas, the same images reproduced again and again, as if the scribes were preserving something they no longer fully understood. The later pharaohs built tombs in imitation of earlier forms, carved inscriptions copied from ancient walls, performed rituals whose original purpose they no longer grasped. They were cosplaying their ancestors, wearing the costume without knowing the character, maintaining forms while losing substance. Political fragmentation accelerated the decline. As Egypt split into competing regions, different temple centers preserved different fragments of the original knowledge system. Memphis held certain texts. Thebes maintained different traditions. Heliopolis guarded its own mysteries. The complete picture, which perhaps required integration of all these fragments, became increasingly difficult to reconstruct. Then came the invasions and the Hyksos in the 17th century BCE, bringing foreign rule and disrupting centuries of tradition. The Assyrians in the 7th century BCE, devastating the Nile Valley. The Persians in the 6th century BCE, and here the damage became severe. Cambyses II, the Persian king who conquered Egypt in 525 BCE, reportedly looted temples, killed sacred bulls, desecrated sanctuaries. Whether the accounts are accurate or propaganda, something broke during this period. The continuity of knowledge transmission, which had survived for thousands of years, suffered rupture it never fully healed from. The mystery schools responded by closing their inner sanctuaries. To protect sacred knowledge from foreign rulers, they created barriers, veils of secrecy, initiatory requirements so stringent that fewer and fewer candidates could penetrate to the deepest teachings. This protective impulse makes sense. If barbarians rule your land, you don't hand them your most precious knowledge. But secrecy has a cost. Knowledge that isn't transmitted dies. Practices that aren't performed are forgotten. techniques that aren't taught to the next generation vanish when the current generation passes. The mystery schools closed their doors to protect their secrets, and in protecting them, ensured they wouldn't survive. By the time Alexander conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, initiating the Ptolemaic period, the system was already dying. Greek intellectuals came to study Egyptian wisdom, Pythagoras supposedly, Plato documented, others whose names we've lost. But what they found wasn't the living tradition of the Old Kingdom. It was fragments, ruins, a priesthood maintaining rituals they could no longer fully explain, preserving texts they could no longer completely interpret, guarding temples whose original functions had become obscure. The Ptolemaic rulers patronized Egyptian religion, built impressive temples, encouraged the preservation of traditions, but they were outsiders, Greeks wearing Egyptian crowns, unable to access the deepest levels of knowledge even when they wanted to. The mystery school showed them the outer courts, shared intermediate teachings, but the innermost sanctuaries remained closed. And with each generation, fewer priests held the complete transmission. Despite the decline, some knowledge centers persisted. Final repositories where the accumulated wisdom of millennia remained accessible, at least partially, at least for a while longer. Alexandria became the final gathering place. The library, founded in the 3rd century BCE by Ptolemy I, attempted something unprecedented, to collect all human knowledge in one location. 400,000 scrolls at its height, maybe more. The accumulated wisdom of Egypt, Greece, Persia, India, Babylon of a thing that could be found, copied, translated, preserved. Egyptian priests brought their sacred texts. Scribes translated hieroglyphics into Greek, creating what we now call the Hermetic corpus writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the Greek name for Thoth. These texts contain fragments of Egyptian wisdom about cosmology, consciousness, the nature of reality, the techniques of transformation. Not the complete knowledge, perhaps, but pieces. Enough to preserve something of what had been known. Scholars came from across the ancient world to study there. Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference using geometry and the angle of shadows at different latitudes, achieving accuracy within a few % of modern measurements. Aristarchus proposed that Earth orbits the Sun, not the reverse heliocentrism 17 centuries before Copernicus. Hypatia taught mathematics and astronomy, becoming one of the ancient world's most respected philosophers. They were building on Egyptian foundations, using knowledge preserved from the Old Kingdom, from the mystery schools, from texts whose origins stretched back beyond recorded memory. The library didn't just store books. It connected present investigation to ancient wisdom, allowing each generation to build on what came before. Egyptian knowledge influenced everything that followed. Pythagoreanism, with its sacred geometry and mathematical mysticism, clearly drew from Egyptian sources, Pythagoras himself having studied in Egypt for decades. Neoplatonism, the philosophical system of Plotinus and his successors, incorporated Egyptian cosmology and concepts of emanation, of the one manifesting as the many. Gnosticism preserved fragments of Egyptian initiatory practice, speaking of direct experiential knowledge gnosis rather than mere belief. These traditions kept pieces of Egyptian wisdom alive, even as the original system declined. Not the complete transmission, perhaps, but echoes. Reflections, enough to suggest what had been lost. Then came the closure. Theodosius I, Roman emperor and Christian convert, issued his decree in 391 CE, all pagan temples must close. The Serapeum in Alexandria, a temple complex that had become a satellite repository of the library's knowledge, was destroyed by Christian mobs. Scrolls burned, statues shattered, priests fled or converted or died. Hypatia's murder in 415 CE symbolized the end. She was dragged from her chariot by a Christian mob, killed in a church, her body dismembered. The last great philosopher of Alexandria, the last link to the ancient traditions, dead in the street. Her students scattered. The philosophical schools closed. The transmission broke. The Library of Alexandria held 400,000 scrolls, the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world. When it burned, we lost not just information, but answers to questions we haven't yet learned to ask. We don't know exactly when or how the library's final destruction occurred. Multiple fires across centuries, each claiming portions of the collection. Gradual decline as patronage dried up and scholars fled. Systematic destruction by those who saw ancient knowledge as threat to new religions. Perhaps all of these. The result remains the same, gone. the last Egyptian temple dedicated to Isis at Philae, closed in 550 CE by order of Justinian, who had maintained unbroken tradition for thousands of years, performed their final rituals and dispersed. The hieroglyphic writing system, which had carried Egyptian thought for 3 millennia, became unreadable within a generation. The language itself died, surviving only in Coptic church liturgy, transformed beyond recognition. What survived? Fragmentary texts, portions of the Hermetic corpus copied by medieval scribes, isolated practices preserved in mystery traditions, though their original context and complete methodology were lost, architectural monuments whose purposes were forgotten, whose alignments were no longer maintained, whose functions became subject to speculation rather than knowledge, and questions, endless questions, questions we can ask because we found the monuments, because fragments of text survived, because echoes of Egyptian wisdom persisted in later traditions. But questions we cannot fully answer because the libraries that held the answers are ash. Not everything burned. Not everything was forgotten. Knowledge has ways of surviving, of finding paths through catastrophe, of persisting in unexpected forms. Medieval Islamic scholars preserved what they could. While Europe descended into centuries of intellectual darkness, Baghdad, Cairo, and Damascus became centers of learning where ancient texts were studied, translated, protected. Egyptian astronomical tables, mathematical treatises, medical knowledge, these survived in Arabic translation long after the Greek originals were lost. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad functioned as Alexandria had, gathering knowledge from across the known world. The Renaissance brought renewed fascination with Egyptian wisdom. Hermeticism, the study of texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, became central to European intellectual life. Marsilio Ficino translated the Corpus Hermeticum in 1463, and suddenly scholars across Europe were reading Egyptian philosophy about the nature of consciousness, the structure of reality, the techniques of transformation. These weren't the complete teachings, but they were enough to inspire, to suggest, to point towards something profound that had been lost. Freemasonry emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries, claiming Egyptian lineage, incorporating pyramids and sphinxes and initiatory degrees supposedly derived from ancient Egyptian mystery schools. Was this actual transmission of hidden knowledge or reinvention based on interpreting monuments? Perhaps both. Perhaps the monuments themselves transmit something to those who study them seriously, even without textual keys or living teachers. Hieroglyphics posed their own mystery for 15 centuries after the last person who could read them died. Renaissance scholars believed they were sacred writing, symbolic rather than phonetic, encoding divine knowledge through images. Then Champollion deciphered them in 1822, revealing they were largely phonetic, a writing system representing sounds, not mystical symbols. Yet perhaps both interpretations contain truth. Perhaps Egyptian writing functioned on multiple levels, simultaneously phonetic for practical communication, but also encoding deeper meanings through image selection, through geometric arrangement, through layers accessible to those with the knowledge to read them. Egyptian astronomical knowledge influenced Islamic astronomy through preserved texts and observations. Islamic astronomers refined these foundations, developed new instruments, made original contributions, then their work influenced European science during the Renaissance and Enlightenment. A winding path of transmission where Egyptian observations and calculations from the Old Kingdom continued shaping human understanding millennia after the civilization that made them had fallen. But the most reliable preservation happened in stone. The pyramids stood when libraries burned. They maintained their alignments while languages died. They preserved their encoded measurements while empires rose and collapsed and were forgotten. Perhaps the pharaohs knew civilization's fall. Perhaps they encoded their knowledge in the one medium that survives collapse, stone. And perhaps we're finally ready to read what they wrote. Modern technology reveals what earlier generations couldn't detect. Satellite imagery discovers structures buried under sand, hidden chambers inside known monuments, patterns visible only from above. Ground-penetrating radar maps what lies beneath without excavation. Muon tomography using cosmic ray particles images the interior of pyramids without drilling a single hole. Acoustic analysis measures resonant frequencies in chambers, discovering that certain spaces produce specific effects on human consciousness and neural activity. computational analysis of dimensions reveals mathematical relationships too complex to be accidental, too consistent to be coincidental. New archaeological techniques find evidence of precision manufacturing, of chemical knowledge, of engineering sophistication we're only beginning to appreciate. We're developing the tools, we're asking the questions, and we're finally capable of recognizing what the evidence suggests that ancient Egypt possessed knowledge and capabilities we're only now rediscovering. We might be the civilization the pharaohs were speaking to across millennia, the intended recipients of messages encoded in stone, waiting for humanity to develop sufficient sophistication to decode them. But that raises the ultimate question: what were they trying to tell us? What was the point of all of it? What if asking, what is the Great Pyramid, is the wrong question? What if we should be asking, what does the Great Pyramid do? Christopher Dunn, the precision engineer, spent decades analysing the Great Pyramid as a machine rather than a monument. His conclusion? It functioned as a power plant, generating electromagnetic energy through processes we're only beginning to understand. The granite in the king's chamber has piezoelectric properties. It generates electrical charge when subjected to pressure or vibration. The internal chamber configurations act as resonators, amplifying specific frequencies. The underground chambers, he suggests, might have contained chemical reactions producing hydrogen, which when vibrated at specific frequencies in the resonant chambers above could generate significant energy. Speculative? Certainly. But it accounts for features the tomb theory doesn't explain. The precision engineering, the choice of specific materials, the chamber configurations that serve no obvious funerary purpose. Then there are the acoustic properties. Modern analysis reveals that the king's chamber produces resonant frequencies at wavelengths precisely matching its dimensions. Strike the granite walls, and the chamber rings like a bell butt at frequencies below and above normal human hearing. Infrasound that you feel rather than hear. Frequencies that affect human consciousness, neural activity, even cellular vibration. Stand in that chamber, chant or sing, and your voice doesn't just echo, it transforms. The stone amplifies certain frequencies while damping others, creating effects that are visceral, physical, undeniable. Is this coincidence, or was the chamber designed specifically to produce these consciousness-altering effects? The astronomical observatory theory has its own compelling evidence. The descending passage points to where Thuban, the pole star of the Old Kingdom, would have been visible. A fixed, stellar sight line maintained for thousands of years. The ascending passages mark the positions of Sirius and Orion's belt at their meridian transit. The entire structure functions as a precision instrument for tracking stellar movements, marking specific alignments that repeat only after vast precessional cycles. But observatories don't need to be built with 2 million tons of stone. They don't require precision measured in millimeters. Unless the observation itself was only part of the purpose, and the mass, the materials, the precision served other functions simultaneously. The initiation chamber theory examines that empty granite box in the king's chamber, the so-called sarcophagus that contained no mummy, no treasure, no evidence of ever being used for burial. What if it served a different purpose entirely? An isolation chamber where initiates underwent transformation experiences. Imagine complete darkness inside the sealed box, surrounded by resonating granite, infrasound affecting your neural activity, perhaps substances ingesting beforehand to heighten sensitivity. Sensory deprivation combined with specific vibrational frequencies, all within a structure astronomically aligned and geometrically perfect. A technology for altering consciousness, for inducing states where dimensional boundaries become permeable, for facilitating whatever transformation the pyramid texts describe as ascending to the sky among the imperishable stars. The time capsule theory focuses on information preservation. The dimensions encode Earth's measurements. The ratios preserve mathematical constants. The alignments mark precessional moments. The entire structure functions as a three-dimensional encyclopedia, preserving crucial knowledge in the most durable form, imaginable relationships between massive stone blocks that will persist long after paper crumbles and digital storage fails. But here's what becomes clear when you examine all these theories together: they're not mutually exclusive. The pyramid could be all of these things simultaneously. Power generator that also functions as an astronomical observatory, an initiation chamber that also preserves information, a consciousness transformation device that also marks cosmic time. This is what sophisticated engineering achieves: multiple purposes integrated into single elegant design. Your smartphone is communication device, camera, computer, GPS navigator, music player, all in one. Why assume ancient engineers were less capable of multi-purpose design? What unifies all these possible functions? Consciousness. The transformation of consciousness. The connection of human awareness to cosmic patterns. The preparation of individuals for transition to states of being the Egyptians described, but we struggle to conceptualize. The pharaohs didn't view the monuments as end products, as achievements to be admired. They viewed them as tools, instruments, components in an ongoing project whose ultimate goals were only beginning to glimpse. But to understand those goals, we need to understand how the pharaohs saw themselves, not as kings, not as political rulers, as something else entirely. Egyptian cosmological texts describe the universe emerging from none the primordial waters, the infinite potential of undifferentiated chaos. Creation wasn't a one-time event but an ongoing process. Order continually emerging from chaos. Structure continually imposed on formlessness. And this process required maintenance, active participation, conscious effort to prevent dissolution back into the primal state. The pharaoh's role in this cosmology wasn't political. It was ontological. He maintained the boundary between existence and non-existence, between cosmos and chaos. What if the pharaohs weren't maintaining a kingdom, but maintaining reality itself, acting as cosmic custodians, preventing Earth's dissolution back into primordial chaos? Look at the daily temple rituals described in wall reliefs and papyri. Each morning, the pharaoh Hor, a high priest, acting as his proxy, entered the inner sanctuary. He broke the seal on the shrine. He awakened the god. Not metaphorically. The texts describe this as activating cosmic forces, setting in motion the daily regeneration of reality. He provided offerings, food, incense, water, described not as gifts to deities but as maintaining energetic exchange, keeping the circulation of cosmic forces flowing. Specific actions performed at astronomically determined times, not whenever convenient, not according to political schedules, according to stellar positions, solar angles, lunar phases, synchronizing terrestrial actions with celestial rhythms, as if timing mattered, as if the relationship between Earth-based ritual and cosmic movements actually did something. Modern physics is beginning to acknowledge what would have seemed absurd a century ago. Consciousness affects reality. The observer effect in quantum mechanics demonstrates that measurement-conscious observation influences what is measured. Reality at the quantum level exists in superposition until consciousness collapses the wave function into definite states. The Egyptians seem to understand this relationship between consciousness and reality expressed in different language. They understood that conscious action, performed with precision at specific times in specific locations, could influence the manifestation of cosmic forces. Egypt itself functioned as a temple nation, not a kingdom with temples in it, but the entire country as sacred space aligned with cosmic patterns. The Nile flowing north mirrored the Milky Way, the celestial Nile flowing across the heavens. Cities positioned according to stellar maps, Memphis corresponding to certain stars, Heliopolis to others. Thebes aligned with yet more, the entire geography of Egypt replicating the geography of the heavens. Temples weren't scattered randomly but positioned with precision, creating a network, a grid, a system of sites working together to maintain cosmic alignment. Pilgrimage routes connected these sites, creating patterns on the ground that echoed patterns in the sky. The pharaoh was described as the one who builds what Ma'at demands, not what he wants. Not what glorifies him, what cosmic order requires. Construction projects weren't expressions of ego but fulfillment of cosmic necessity. Building what the universal order needed built. At the time, it needed building, in the location and form and proportion that served the maintenance of Ma'at. This reframes everything. The monuments weren't vanity projects. They were maintenance equipment. Infrastructure for cosmic operations. The pharaoh wasn't an autocrat indulging architectural fantasies. He was an operator performing assigned tasks within a system larger than himself. Think of it like this. Organization requires continuous energy input. Life fights entropy by constantly importing energy and exporting disorder. Consciousness maintains coherent patterns against the universal tendency toward randomness. Civilization preserves knowledge and structure despite the forces of forgetting and decay. The pharaohs seem to understand that maintaining high levels of order, cosmic, terrestrial, social, spiritual, requires deliberate, informed action. That consciousness represents a crucial organizing principle in the universe. That human consciousness, properly trained and precisely directed, can participate in universal ordering processes. That the boundary between chaos and cosmos isn't fixed and permanent, but requires constant maintenance. And that the pharaoh, as the apex of human consciousness development in his civilization, bore responsibility for performing that maintenance. But maintaining cosmic order raises an obvious question. Maintaining it toward what end? What was the goal? What were they trying to achieve through millennia of precise ritual, astronomical observation, monument construction, and consciousness development? Egyptian texts call the pharaoh the one who opens the way, not the one who rules, not the one who commands. The one who opens the way? A pathfinder, a pioneer, someone who goes first into unknown territory so others can follow. What if that's literal? What if the pharaoh's journey through death and dimensional transition wasn't just personal salvation, but demonstration? Proof of concept, showing that the transformation is possible, that the navigation can be done, that humans can successfully transition from physical existence to stellar existence if they know the techniques, perform the procedures, maintain the precision. Early in Egyptian history, only the pharaoh could achieve stellar immortality. The texts are clear on this. The transformation, the ascension, the joining with the imperishable stars, these were pharaonic privileges. But watch what happens over time. Middle Kingdom texts begin extending these possibilities to nobles and high officials. By the New Kingdom, anyone who could afford the proper preparation, the correct rituals, the necessary texts could attempt the journey. This looks like democratization. The gradual spreading of transformation technology from an elite few to the broader population. Not because the technology changed, but because understanding spread. Because what the pharaoh demonstrated, others learned they could also achieve. The monuments themselves might be part of this dissemination strategy. They don't just encode information. They generate conditions, the acoustic properties, the geometric proportions, the material compositions, the astronomical alignments. All of these create specific effects that persist whether or not anyone understands them. A transformation facilitator that remains operative long after its builders are gone, continuing to produce the resonances, the frequencies, the alignments that support consciousness development. What if the pharaohs were preparing humanity for future evolutionary steps? Think about it. They developed techniques for consciousness expansion. They explored multi-dimensional awareness. They claimed to navigate realms beyond physical existence. They preserved this knowledge not just in fragile texts, but in monuments designed to last geological timescales. Why? Who were they preserving it for? The texts suggest they understood human evolution as cyclical. Each cosmic age, each precessional epoch lasting roughly 2,000 years, requires different capabilities. What works in one age becomes obsolete in the next. The consciousness that thrives under one stellar configuration struggles under another. Humanity must evolve to match the changing cosmic conditions, and the pharaohs position themselves as those preparing tools and knowledge for future stages, building transformation technology that would remain functional across multiple precessional cycles, encoding wisdom that would become accessible when humanity developed the sophistication to decode it. What if the pyramids aren't ancient history but future history tools prepared for a humanity that would eventually develop the consciousness capable of using them? Look at modern human consciousness. Look at what's emerging now, in our time. Growing interest in meditation and altered states. Explosion of research into psychedelics and their consciousness-expanding effects. Quantum physics, demonstrating that consciousness and reality interact in ways that validate ancient claims. Increasing acknowledgement of multidimensional reality, of dimensions beyond the perceivable three. We're developing exactly the capabilities the pharaohs described. We're asking exactly the questions their texts address. We're finally sophisticated enough to recognize that consciousness might not be confined to physical brains, that reality might have dimensions we can't normally perceive, that transformation beyond physical existence might be possible. We're living in the future the pharaohs prepared for. Their project wasn't completed in their time. It was initiated in their time. The monuments they built, the knowledge they encoded, the techniques they developed, these were seeds planted for a distant harvest, tools created for descendants so distant that the connection would be forgotten, the original purpose obscured, the intended users uncertain they were intended users at all, until the moment when modern humans, exploring their own consciousness, studying ancient monuments, bridging science and spirituality, suddenly recognize we're the ones they were preparing for. We're the future generation equipped to continue what they started. But that raises crucial questions about how knowledge transfers across such vast temporal and cultural distances. About hidden lineages, about secret transmissions, about whether the connection is truly broken or merely hidden. Pharaonic succession should be straightforward. Father to son, bloodline, dynasty. That's how monarchy works. Except in Egypt, it frequently didn't work that way at all. Hatshepsut, one of the most successful pharaohs, wasn't heir to anything. She was a regent for her stepson, then simply declared herself pharaoh despite having no direct claim to the throne. Amenhotep I had no sons, so the succession passed to a military commander who married his daughter. Horemheb, the last pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, came from outside the royal family, entirely a general who became king through processes the records don't clearly explain. Why did some pharaohs train for decades before ruling? Why did succession skip bloodlines, unless the title required capabilities that couldn't be inherited unly developed? Her regencies offer revealing clues. Amenhotep III ruled alongside his son Akhenaten for potentially 12 years. Thutmose III trained under Hatshepsut for 22 years before assuming sole power. These weren't brief apprenticeships. These were decades-long preparation periods during which the heir learned something that apparently couldn't be taught quickly. Standard Egyptology interprets co-regencies as political arrangements, ensuring smooth transitions, preventing succession disputes, allowing the heir to gain administrative experience. But administrative experience doesn't require 20 years. Managing a bureaucracy, commanding armies, negotiating with foreign powers, these are skills measured in months or a few years at most, not decades. Unless they were learning something else. Unless the pharaonic role required capabilities that took decades to develop, that demanded intensive training under someone who had already achieved them, that couldn't be acquired through study alone, but required direct transmission from initiate to successor. Texts refer to choosing the divine seed, describing selection processes that evaluated candidates on criteria the records don't specify, not just bloodline, not just political alliance, something about the individual themselves. Some quality that could be recognized, identified, confirmed before intensive training began. The Egyptian concept of the Beophon, translated as soul or personality, but perhaps better understood as consciousness. Essence included the belief that certain Bay qualities could be identified early. A child showing signs of advanced Ba development might be selected for training regardless of birth circumstances. The pharaonic role might have been less about who your father was and more about what your consciousness demonstrated capacity to become. This would explain the adoption practices. Pharaohs adopting heirs from outside the immediate family, sometimes from noble houses, occasionally from completely unexpected sources. If the role requires rare natural capabilities plus decades of development, you select candidates who show the aptitude, then train them regardless of bloodline. Akhenaten's radical reforms might represent conflict between different understandings of what the pharaonic role should be. He abandoned traditional theology, declared only the Aten worthy of worship, moved the capital to a new city, attempted to restructure Egyptian cosmology from the ground up. Orthodox history explains this as political maneuvering against the priesthood. But what if it represented something more fundamental, disagreement about whether the pharaoh should be exoteric political ruler or esoteric cosmic functionary? What if Akhenaten believed previous pharaohs had lost the essential understanding, had become mere kings when they should be cosmic engineers? What if his reforms attempted to restore what he believed was the original purpose, and the priesthood resisted because they had their own understanding, their own lineage of transmission, their own version of what had been lost and what needed preserving? The succession question reveals something profound. The pharaonic system involved more than political inheritance. It involved capabilities that required identification, selection, decades of training, direct transmission from those who possessed them to those capable of developing them. Which raises the inevitable question, when the pharaonic system ended, when the last initiated pharaoh died, when Egypt fell to foreign rulers, what happened to that knowledge? did it disappear entirely? Or did it find other paths, other vessels, other forms of transmission? For 2,000 years, secret societies have claimed to preserve Egyptian wisdom. Were they preserving actual knowledge or inventing elaborate fantasies? What if it's both fragments of truth wrapped in layers of interpretation? The Hermetic tradition takes its name from Hermes, Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes, the Greek identification of Egyptian Thoth. The Corpus Hermeticum, translated into Latin in the 15th century, contains texts on astrology, alchemy, theurgy, cosmology. They describe the universe as mental, consciousness as creative force, matter as condensed spirit. These ideas sound Egyptian. They echo themes from the pyramid texts and temple inscriptions. But were they written by Egyptian priests preserving ancient knowledge, or by later Hellenistic philosophers synthesizing Egyptian and Greek thought into something new? Probably both. Genuine Egyptian concepts filtered through Greek understanding, modified by Roman philosophy, preserved by Arabic scholars, eventually reaching Renaissance Europe as fragments whose original context had been lost, but whose power remained. Gnostic Christianity incorporated heavy Egyptian influence. The concept of gnosis, direct experiential knowledge rather than belief parallels, Egyptian initiation practices. Gnostic texts found at Nag Hammadi described cosmologies that mirror Egyptian understanding of emanation, of the divine manifesting through progressive densification into material reality. The Gnostics were declared heretics, their texts burned, their communities scattered. But they were preserving something, even if imperfectly, even if mixed with later additions. Islamic Sufism, particularly in Egypt, claimed to preserve pre-Islamic wisdom. Dhul Nun al-Misri, a 9th century Egyptian Sufi master, reportedly could read hieroglyphics centuries before Champollion's decipherment. He taught techniques of heart-centered consciousness, of spiritual stations and states, of transformation through direct experience. His methods echo Egyptian initiatory practices. Coincidence or continuity? Medieval alchemy emerged from Alexandria, from that final mixing of Egyptian, Greek and Islamic knowledge before the libraries burned. Alchemical texts speak in symbolic language, turning lead into gold, finding the philosopher's stone, achieving the great work. Are these chemical processes, psychological transformations, or both? The symbolism is Egyptian. The gold transformation of base material into perfected form mirrors Egyptian cosmology. But the actual procedures, the transmitted knowledge, the working techniques, these remain obscured beneath layers of symbolic language designed to protect secrets from the uninitiated. The Templar Knights spent time in the Middle East during the Crusades. Legends claim they discovered texts or artifacts in Egypt, that they gained access to knowledge that influenced their practices and eventually contributed to their persecution. No proof exists, but the legends persist, suggesting something, whether actual discovery or cultural memory, connected the Templars to Egyptian wisdom. Rosicrucian manifestos in the 17th century claimed their legendary founder, Christian Rosenkreuz, received initiation in Egypt. The manifestos describe a brotherhood preserving ancient knowledge, working to transform human consciousness, preparing humanity for evolutionary advancement. Pure invention or garbled account of actual lineages. The manifestos shaped Western esotericism for centuries, whether or not their claims were historically accurate. Freemasonry incorporates elaborate Egyptian symbolism, pyramids, sphinxes, initiatory degrees supposedly derived from Egyptian mystery schools. Modern Freemasonry dates to the 18th century, far too late for direct Egyptian transmission. But the symbols mean something to those who work with them. The rituals produce effects regardless of historical accuracy. Perhaps the monuments themselves transmit knowledge to those who study them seriously, creating new lineages without requiring unbroken historical continuity. Here's what's striking: the persistence. Across 2 millennia, across multiple cultures, across different religious and philosophical frameworks, humans kept trying to recover Egyptian wisdom, to preserve it, to reconstruct it, to reconnect with whatever had been lost. This persistent pattern suggests recognition that something profound existed in Egypt, something worth seeking even when the original transmission had broken. But organized traditions aren't the only way knowledge survives. Sometimes it persists in simpler forms, scattered practices, isolated techniques, fragments preserved outside institutions entirely. Knowledge has ways of surviving that don't involve grand institutions or secret societies. Sometimes it persists in the simplest forms, a medical formula copied into a monastery ledger, a calculation method taught from master to apprentice, a practice maintained because it works even when no one remembers why. Coptic monasteries in Egypt preserved medical knowledge long after the temples closed, herbal formulae for treating specific conditions, surgical techniques for setting bones and treating wounds, psychological treatments involving specific chants, specific visualizations, specific breathing patterns. The monks didn't necessarily understand these as Egyptian survivals. They were simply effective treatments passed down, still working centuries after their origins were forgotten. Egyptian astronomical observations influenced Islamic astronomy, which created the foundation for European science. The path winds, the attribution gets lost, but the knowledge continues. Calculations originally made by Egyptian priest astronomers tracking stellar movements eventually informed Copernicus, Kepler, Newton, the chain of transmission, obscured but unbroken. Modern rediscoveries keep revealing how much was lost. The Nag Hammadi Library found in 1945 clay jars buried in the Egyptian desert containing Gnostic and Hermetic texts, many previously unknown. New tomb discoveries providing fresh papyri, additional inscriptions, expanded understanding of Egyptian thought. Each find revealing sophistication that previous scholarship had underestimated. But the most striking rediscoveries come from modern science accidentally validating what the Egyptians claimed all along. Acoustic analysis of pyramid chambers reveals resonant frequencies that affect human neural activity. The Egyptians described these chambers as transformation spaces. Modern neuroscience confirms that specific sound frequencies alter brainwave patterns, induce altered states, affect consciousness in measurable ways. Spectroscopic analysis of Egyptian pigments shows chemical knowledge more advanced than we assumed. Complex compounds requiring multi-stage synthesis, precise temperature control, understanding of chemical reactions that supposedly weren't formalized until modern chemistry. Yet there they are on temple walls, achieving colors that haven't faded in 4,000 years. Engineering analysis keeps discovering construction techniques we can't fully explain with the tools we assume they possessed. Core drilling showing feed rates that exceed modern capabilities. Stone cutting achieving precision that our best equipment struggles to match. Not impossible, just unexplained by conventional models of ancient technology. Modern consciousness research rediscovers Egyptian insights about the nature of awareness. Studies of altered states validate ancient claims about navigable dimensions of consciousness accessible through specific practices. Psychedelic research reveals experiences matching Egyptian descriptions of transformation, of encountering beings of light, of perceiving reality as multidimensional. Research on meditation and contemplative practices confirms that consciousness can be systematically developed, transformed, expanded, exactly what Egyptian initiation practices claim to achieve. Modern physics converges with ancient Egyptian cosmology in ways that would have seemed impossible a century ago. Quantum mechanics demonstrates that observation affects reality, that consciousness and physical manifestation interact. Egyptian understanding of thought as creative force, of consciousness shaping what manifests. Theories of higher dimensions parallel Egyptian descriptions of multiple realms, multiple states of being, beyond the physically perceivable. Studies of biophotons show that living organisms emit light. Egyptian concept of the Akh, the transformed being of light, might be less metaphorical than we assumed. Research into human electromagnetic fields reveals measurable energetic patterns surrounding the body, what the Egyptians called the Ka, what later traditions call the aura, not mystical fantasy, measurable phenomenon. Modern science keeps discovering that the Egyptians were right. Consciousness affects reality. Humans emit light. Multiple dimensions exist. Sound shapes matter. Death might be transformation rather than termination. How did they know? Perhaps because they investigated. They experimented. They observed. They developed techniques and tested results across generations. They practice science, just not the way we practice science. Different methods, different frameworks, different language, but the same fundamental drive to understand reality and consciousness. If ancient Egyptian knowledge is being rediscovered and validated by modern science, what does this mean for us? How should we engage with this recovered wisdom? We're living through a crisis of consciousness and meaning. People describe feeling disconnected, fragmented, uncertain of purpose. They sense something missing, some fundamental understanding that previous generations possessed, but we've lost. Mental health deteriorates despite material abundance. anxiety and depression reach epidemic levels. People search for meaning in careers, in consumption, in digital distraction, yet the emptiness persists. The Egyptians identified consciousness transformation as humanity's primary task, not wealth accumulation, not political power, not technological advancement, the development and transformation of consciousness itself. They built an entire civilization around this priority, investing resources we can barely imagine into creating systems, practices, and technologies for consciousness evolution. We're rediscovering their practices now, calling them new when they're ancient. Meditation has exploded across Western culture, millions practicing techniques for altering consciousness, for achieving states beyond ordinary awareness. Psychedelic research reveals that substances like psilocybin facilitate profound transformative experiences, healing trauma, dissolving ego boundaries, creating lasting changes in consciousness. These aren't modern discoveries. They're rediscoveries of what Egypt systematized thousands of years ago. The environmental crisis poses existential threat. Climate change, ecosystem collapse, mass extinction. We're finally recognizing what should have been obvious. Humanity must live in balance with natural and cosmic systems or face catastrophic consequences. This is Ma'at cosmic order, universal balance, the principle that guided pharaonic civilization. They understood that civilization exists within nature, not separate from it. That human order must align with cosmic order, or it collapses into chaos. Modern physics grapples with questions that sound increasingly Egyptian. Does consciousness affect reality? Do dimensions exist beyond the perceivable three? What is the relationship between observation and manifestation? Quantum mechanics suggests consciousness plays a fundamental role in reality structure. String theory proposes dimensions we cannot directly perceive. Observer effects demonstrate that measurement influences what is measured. The Egyptians addressed these exact questions through different frameworks, different language, but with remarkable convergence towards similar conclusions. Architecture is rediscovering sacred geometry. Designers incorporate harmonic proportions, golden ratios, resonant frequencies into buildings intended to affect human consciousness and well-being. This isn't new, this is Egyptian. They understood that geometry shapes consciousness, that proportions create effects, that buildings can be designed to facilitate specific states of awareness. Research into consciousness, after death, near-death experiences, out-of-body states validates claims we dismissed as superstition. People report navigating dimensional spaces, encountering beings of light, experiencing consciousness independent of physical bodies. They describe these experiences with remarkable consistency across cultures and time periods. The Egyptians described precisely these experiences in the pyramid texts and Book of the Dead. We called them mythology. Now we're calling them data. Modern humanity develops cosmic perspective. We understand Earth as a planet orbiting a star in a galaxy among billions. We recognize ourselves as cosmically embedded, not terrestrial creatures trapped on a random rock, but conscious beings participating in vast universal processes. This perspective, cosmic citizenship, cosmic identity, shows the Egyptian stellar perspective that saw humans as fundamentally connected to the stars, to cosmic cycles, to patterns far larger than individual lives or civilizations. We're facing questions about consciousness, cosmic purpose, life after death, and living in balance with universal order. The Egyptians spent 3,000 years studying exactly these questions. Perhaps we should check their answers. Our current challenges might result partly from losing the wisdom Egypt tried to preserve. Ecological imbalance from forgetting Ma'at, consciousness fragmentation from abandoning transformation practices, loss of meaning from disconnecting from cosmic context. The solutions we seek might not require new invention, but recovery of what was known and lost. The Egyptian legacy isn't dead history, it's living relevance. Their questions are our questions. Their challenges mirror ours. The wisdom they developed, the practices they refined, the knowledge they encoded, these address precisely what contemporary humanity desperately needs. Which raises the practical question, what specific insights, practices or principles from Egyptian wisdom can we actually apply to modern life? Ma'at translates as truth, justice, cosmic order, but it functions as practical life philosophy applicable to decisions we make every day. Speak truth, even when lies would be easier. Act justly, even when injustice would be profitable. Maintain balance in all things. Live in harmony with natural order rather than fighting against it. These aren't abstract ideals, they're operational principles. When facing environmental policy decisions, ask, does this maintain balance or create imbalance? When confronting ethical dilemmas, ask, does this preserve order or generate chaos? The Egyptian framework provides guidance for navigating complexity that purely utilitarian or rights-based ethics sometimes struggle with. Egyptian wisdom texts described contemplative practices remarkably similar to modern mindfulness. Sitting in stillness, observing breath, watching thoughts without attachment, developing witness consciousness, the capacity to observe your own mental processes from a position of detachment. They understood what neuroscience now confirms. Consciousness can be systematically trained, attention can be strengthened, awareness can be expanded through specific practices performed consistently over time. Their understanding of death offers profound psychological benefit. Death isn't termination, but transformation. Not an ending to fear, but a transition to prepare for. This perspective doesn't require believing literally in the afterlife, as Egyptians described it. It requires recognizing that consciousness might be more than brain activity, that identity might persist through radical transformation, that what we call death might be doorway rather than wall. Modern disconnection from natural cycles creates psychological and physiological problems. We live by artificial light, ignore seasonal rhythms, remain indoors regardless of weather. Egyptian practice involved deliberate alignment with cosmic and natural cycles rising with the sun, marking lunar phases, observing seasonal transitions. Simple practices, spending time outside during sunrise and sunset, noting moon phases and their effects on your energy and consciousness. Recognizing that you're embedded in cyclical processes larger than yourself, the Egyptians maintained stable, sophisticated civilization for 3,000 years. Most modern nations haven't lasted 300. Perhaps they understood something about sustainability, cosmic, social, and psychological, that we need to relearn. They thought in terms of eternity, built monuments meant to last millennia, planned for futures they'd never see. This long-term perspective offers models for addressing contemporary challenges requiring multi-generational thinking, climate change, knowledge preservation, civilizational sustainability. Egyptian temporal scale thinking in centuries and millennia rather than quarters and election cycles provides framework for approaching problems that can't be solved within individual lifetimes. They integrated what we fragment. Art wasn't separate from science. Spirituality wasn't separate from daily life. Architecture incorporated mathematics, astronomy, consciousness technology, symbolic meaning, practical functional in unified vision. Our modern fragmentation specialists who know everything about nothing, isolated domains that don't communicate, creates problems Egyptian integration might address. The Egyptian model of multiple aspects of Selfka, Ba, Ark, Kart, Sarhoff's framework for contemporary psychology more sophisticated than simple mind-body dualism. Different aspects of consciousness serving different functions, accessible through different practices, developing through different processes. This maps remarkably well onto modern understanding of multiple memory systems, different states of consciousness, various modes of information processing. A practice of preservation remains urgently relevant, preserving knowledge across civilizational transitions, maintaining measurements and standards despite cultural change, protecting crucial information from loss. We face similar challenges, preserving digital information that might not be readable in decades, maintaining scientific knowledge despite funding cuts and political interference, protecting essential wisdom from forgetting. Individual practices matter, but they point toward larger questions about what Egyptian wisdom means for human civilization as a whole, for the trajectory of our species, for the challenges we face collectively rather than individually. Egypt endured for 3,000 years. The millennia of continuous cultural and religious identity. Dynasties rose and fell. Capitals moved. Foreign invasions disrupted but didn't destroy. The civilization persisted, maintained core knowledge and practices across time spans that dwarf most human political entities. What enabled this extraordinary continuity? What allowed Egypt to preserve knowledge across such vast temporal distance? Redundancy. They encoded knowledge in multiple formats. Written texts for scholars. Oral tradition for priests. Ritual practice for initiates. Architectural encoding for those who could read stone. Artistic representation preserving symbolic information. When one format failed, others survived. When libraries burned, monuments remained. When foreign conquest disrupted oral transmission, texts preserved fragments. When languages died, architecture continued, speaking to those who learned its geometric vocabulary. Modern civilization, for all its technological sophistication, might be more fragile than ancient Egypt. We depend on complex, interdependent systems vulnerable to cascading failure. Our knowledge lives primarily in digital formats that require continuous technological infrastructure to access. Our expertise becomes hyper-specialized, creating systems no individual fully understands. Our temporal perspective contracts to quarterly profits and election cycles, losing capacity for multi-generational thinking. The Egyptians focused on fundamentals: astronomy tracking cosmic cycles, mathematics understanding universal patterns, architecture creating structures that endure, agriculture working with natural rhythms, consciousness developing human potential. These domains remain essential regardless of technological level. A civilization that preserves this fundamental knowledge can rebuild after collapse. A civilization that loses it cannot. Their obsession with permanence and eternity might reflect profound understanding. Civilizations are temporary, but human consciousness continues. Individual empires fall, specific cultures disappear, but consciousness itself, the human capacity for awareness, understanding, growth persists across the civilizational cycles. This makes knowledge preservation not a cultural preference but a cosmic responsibility. Building for eternity because the knowledge will be needed again by humans we'll never meet, facing challenges we cannot foresee. The Egyptians built for eternity because they understood that civilizations fall but human consciousness continues. They were speaking to use across the gap of civilizational collapse, hoping we would listen before we repeat their mistakes. We might be entering a phase where Egyptian wisdom becomes particularly relevant. A transition to cosmic consciousness as humanity recognizes itself as planetary species embedded in universal processes. Potential contact with non-human intelligence requiring frameworks for understanding consciousness beyond human form. Necessity of living sustainably within planetary boundaries. Ma'at at civilizational scale. Development of technologies affecting consciousness and reality in ways Egyptian wisdom addressed: artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, consciousness-altering substances, virtual realities that blur boundaries between dimensions. What if the Pharaohs' grand project wasn't completed in their time but continues now? What if we're not just studying their legacy but inheriting their work? What if the monuments, the preserved knowledge, the encoded wisdom represent not finished achievements, but tools handed forward, work initiated but requiring continuation by future humans who would eventually develop the sophistication to recognize what they've been given? We might be those future humans. The civilization they prepared for. The generation equipped to decode what they encoded, to understand what they preserved, to continue what they began. Civilizational cycles might not be endpoints but phases in ongoing human evolutionary process, each cyclerizing, flowering, declining, collapsing teaches. Each civilization develops certain capacities, explores certain possibilities, discovers certain knowledge. When the civilization falls, much is lost, but fragments survive. Threads persist, and the next cycle, when it rises, inherits those fragments, builds on what came before even when the connection isn't recognized. Egypt's legacy suggests that human knowledge accumulates despite apparent ruptures. That wisdom preserved in one epoch informs development in the next. That consciousness evolves through civilizational cycles, each contributing to the larger story of what humanity is becoming. Given everything we've explored, who the Pharaohs were, what they knew, what they tried to preserve, what does this mean for humanity's future? What unfinished work did they leave us? What are we meant to do with this inheritance? Egyptian texts speak of the work of eternity and the path that continues, not the work that was completed, not the path that ended, the work that continues. The path still being walked, language suggesting they understood their project as something extending far beyond individual lifespans, beyond dynasties, beyond their civilization itself. Watch how pyramid construction evolved across the Old Kingdom. Joseph's Step, pyramid, experimental, innovative, testing concepts. The bent pyramid at Dashur changing angle mid-construction, suggesting they discovered something during building that required modification. The red pyramid incorporating lessons learned, achieving true pyramid form, then Khufu's Great Pyramid sudden perfection, as if all previous construction had been preparation for this singular achievement. This looks like progressive refinement, each structure incorporating knowledge gained from earlier attempts, each generation building on what came before, advancing towards some ultimate goal or capability. But here's what's fascinating. Later pharaohs spent enormous resources restoring and maintaining pyramids they didn't build. 5th and 6th dynasty rulers repairing 3rd and 4th dynasty monuments, New Kingdom pharaohs maintaining structures already ancient in their time. They described themselves not as creators, but as restorers, as maintainers, as those continuing work begun by predecessors. They understood themselves as inheritors of an ongoing project, responsible for preserving and advancing it, knowing they wouldn't see its completion. Then pyramid building stopped. Not gradually, not through slow decline. It simply ceased after the Middle Kingdom. The knowledge required to construct these massive, precisely aligned, astronomically encoded structures apparently vanished. Or was it withdrawn? Was it deliberately ended because that phase of the project had achieved its purpose? The shift from pyramids to valley tombs might represent intentional evolution, different cosmic conditions requiring different technologies, different phases of human consciousness development requiring different facilitating structures. Or it might represent catastrophic knowledge lost later, generations unable to continue what earlier ones had accomplished. Certain texts describe rituals requiring specific astronomical alignments that occur only at vast intervals. The opening of the mouth ceremony, for instance, was performed at precise stellar configurations. Some alignments repeat annually. Others require decades. Some occur only once in processional cycles lasting thousands of years. What if the pharaohs knew they wouldn't finish? What if they were deliberately creating a relay race across civilizations, passing the baton to runners in an unimaginably distant future? What if we're the next runners? This would explain why they built in stone rather than more sophisticated materials. Stone survives. Stone endures geological timescales. If your project requires continuation by civilizations separated from yours by millennia of collapse and darkness, you build in the medium that will definitely persist. It would explain the redundant encoding, information preserved multiple ways because you expect partial destruction, expect future investigators working with incomplete evidence, need to ensure enough survives for reconstruction. It would explain the astronomical encoding marking specific processional moments. Not commemorating when the monuments were built, but marking when specific cosmic conditions accrue information crucial for future continuers who need to know when certain work becomes possible again. The pharaohs might have understood they were operating within a specific window of cosmic opportunity, a particular alignment of stellar, solar and precessional cycles that enabled certain work, cosmic conditions that would eventually shift, closing certain possibilities while opening others. Their task was to accomplish what could be accomplished during their window and encode enough information for future civilizations operating under different cosmic conditions to continue the project. Evidence suggests they expected their civilization to fall. The Edfu texts speak of previous destructions, previous collapses, previous cycles. They knew civilizations are temporary. They built anyway, not despite this knowledge, but because of it. Building for the future they wouldn't see, for the humans who would eventually find the monuments and wonder what they meant. They expected their knowledge to fragment, expected their monuments to be misunderstood, expected centuries or millennia of darkness when no one would comprehend what had been built or why. But they also expected eventual rediscovery, expected future humans developing the capability to decode what had been encoded, expected recognition that the monuments weren't ancient history but ancient future planning tools prepared for use by civilizations advanced enough to understand them. If that's true, if we are those future humans, what exactly would continuing the work entail? The transformation, the pharaohs' pursued consciousness, evolution, dimensional navigation, stellar becoming wasn't completed in their time. It couldn't be. Transformation isn't a destination but a process, unfolding across generations, requiring each era to engage anew with possibilities that never exhaust themselves. Modern developments suggest we're entering a phase where the next steps become possible. Consciousness research maps neural correlates of meditation, psychedelics, altered states, providing scientific frameworks for experiences the Egyptians described as navigating the duat. Neuroscience reveals brain plasticity, the capacity for consciousness to literally reshape its physical substrate through practice. Quantum physics demonstrates consciousness affecting reality at fundamental levels, validating ancient understanding that awareness shapes manifestation. We're developing the capabilities necessary for the next phase. Look at the explosion of interesting practices the Pharaohs systematized. Meditation goes mainstream, millions practicing techniques for altering consciousness. Psychedelic research reveals these substances facilitate genuine transformation, lasting changes in consciousness structure and capability. Sound healing rediscovers what Egyptian temple architects encoded in chamber dimensions. Sacred geometry appears in contemporary architecture as designers recognize that proportions affect consciousness. Is this independent rediscovery or cultural memory activation? As humanity reaches specific developmental stages, does knowledge become accessible that couldn't be grasped earlier? The monuments stand, waiting. The encoded information persists. Perhaps when collective human consciousness reaches sufficient sophistication, what was always there suddenly becomes visible, readable, usable. Human consciousness itself might be evolving. We're developing capabilities our ancestors lacked: abstract thinking, scientific method, technological extension of perception. But perhaps we're also developing subtler capabilities, the ones the Egyptians cultivated deliberately: greater capacity for sustained attention, deeper access to altered states, enhanced ability to navigate non-ordinary dimensions of consciousness. The Pharaohs might have been attempting to accelerate this natural evolutionary process, not creating capabilities from nothing, but identifying latent potential and providing tools, techniques, knowledge to develop it faster than would occur through random mutation and natural selection. They offered a curriculum for consciousness evolution. Most ignored it, some engaged partially, a few mastered it, and they encoded everything so future generations, when ready, could continue the work. Contemporary developments might represent continuation of their agenda. Projects to build monuments lasting geological timescales, the Svalbard Seed Vault, the Memory of Mankind Archive, proposals for warning markers at nuclear waste sites that must remain comprehensible for 10,000 years. Knowledge preservation against civilizational, collapsed distributed networks, multiple formats, geographic redundancy. The same strategies Egypt employed. Research into consciousness and physical reality explores questions the Pharaohs investigated. Does consciousness survive bodily death? Can awareness navigate dimensions beyond the physical? What is the relationship between observation and manifestation? We're asking their questions using different tools, different frameworks, but pursuing the same fundamental mysteries. Technologies for extending life, enhancing cognition, perhaps eventually achieving post-biological existence. These efforts echo Egyptian attempts at transformation beyond physical limits. We approach it through biology and technology. They approached it through ritual and consciousness practice. Different methods towards similar goals, transcending the limitations of unmodified human existence. Space exploration might represent continuation of the Pharaohs' stellar focus. They pursued consciousness journeys to the stars, transformation into stellar existence. We're beginning physical journeys to the stars, technological extension beyond Earth. Perhaps both approaches consciousness transformation and physical exploration are necessary. Perhaps they converge, and W6gen may. Perhaps becoming a spacefaring species requires also becoming a species with transformed consciousness, capable of navigating the psychological and spiritual challenges of cosmic existence. They tried to teach us how to become more than human, how to expand consciousness beyond physical limits, how to navigate dimensions beyond the perceivable three, how to achieve transformation they called becoming a star. The curriculum is still available. The monuments still stand. The initiation is still offered to those who approach with readiness. The ultimate continuation of the pharaonic project might involve achieving what they described: human consciousness capable of deliberate dimensional navigation, surviving physical death not through hope but through skill, attaining states of being where the distinction between physical and non-physical becomes navigable rather than absolute. This isn't fantasy. This is the logical extension of capabilities we're already developing. enhanced states through meditation and psychedelics, technologies extending perception beyond normal limits, understanding that consciousness and reality interact in ways we're only beginning to formalize. But fundamental questions remain. Questions about who the pharaohs actually were, how they acquired their knowledge, what they ultimately achieved. Questions that might not have simple answers but deserve serious consideration. What if the pharaohs were more than just kings? We've traced the evidence across 9 chapters. The astronomical knowledge precise enough to track precessional cycles. The mathematical sophistication encoding Earth's dimensions in stone. The architectural achievements we struggle to replicate with modern equipment. The consciousness technologies producing measurable effects on neural activity. The transformation systems designed to navigate dimensional transitions. The knowledge preservation strategies that succeeded across millennia. The cosmic perspective that saw humans as stellar beings temporarily inhabiting physical form. The accumulated evidence suggests they were priest-scientists, exploring consciousness with systematic rigor, cosmic engineers maintaining Earth's alignment with universal patterns, knowledge custodians, preserving wisdom from earlier epochs, agents of transformation facilitating human evolutionary development, initiates into mysteries that modern science is only beginning to acknowledge exist. But let's examine probability gradations honestly. It seems certain they were more astronomically sophisticated than conventional history acknowledges. The alignments are measurable. The encoded cycles are verifiable. The precision exceeds what we attributed to them. Very likely they possessed mathematical knowledge exceeding our assumptions. The relationships appear too consistently to be coincidental. The same ratios, the same constants, the same geometric principles appearing across structures built over centuries. Probable that they understood consciousness technologies we've forgotten. The acoustic properties of chambers aren't accidental. The effects on neural activity are measurable. The systematic nature of their practices suggests empirical investigation rather than superstitious ritual. Possible that they navigated dimensions of reality we're only theorizing about. The texts describe it. The practices seem designed for it. Modern physics provides frameworks where such navigation isn't impossible, just currently beyond our capability to achieve or verify. Uncertain but intriguing that they possessed even more advanced capabilities, technologies we haven't recognized, knowledge we can't yet conceptualize, achievements that remain completely outside our current frameworks of possibility. What prevents fuller acknowledgement? Academic conservatism resisting revision of established narratives. Eurocentric historical frameworks assuming civilization progresses linearly from primitive to advanced. Materialist bias against consciousness-based technologies that can't be measured with conventional instruments. Difficulty integrating ancient wisdom expressed in religious language with modern science expressed in mathematical formalism. Simple resistance to admitting we might have been wrong about fundamental assumptions. What would change if we fully acknowledged Egyptian sophistication? We'd need to reconsider what's possible for pre-industrial civilizations, reassess what knowledge might have been lost in civilizational collapses, open serious investigation into consciousness technologies and multidimensional reality, recognize that ancient monuments might have purposes we haven't considered, acknowledge that human civilization might be older and more sophisticated in its earlier phases than we've assumed. The implications are vast, uncomfortable, requiring revision of narratives we've built entire academic disciplines upon. We've asked, what if the pharaohs were more than just kings? Perhaps the better question is, what if we're less than what we could be, and they were trying to show us how to become more? The question isn't meant to have a single answer. It's an invitation to ongoing investigation, to examining evidence with fresh eyes, to considering possibilities we've been trained to dismiss, to recognizing that mystery doesn't equal impossibility, that unanswered questions don't invalidate serious inquiry, that what we don't yet understand might nevertheless be real. Pharaohs remain enigmatic, their full capabilities uncertain, their ultimate achievements debated. But the evidence suggests they were far more than conventional rulers building elaborate tombs. They were something else, something we're only beginning to comprehend. And regardless of which specific interpretations prove accurate, their legacy offers profound gifts to anyone willing to receive them. Egypt gives us perspective. 3,000 years of continuous civilization demonstrates that human societies can endure across timescales that dwarf our political entities. That sophisticated understanding doesn't require industrial technology. that there are multiple paths to knowledge and wisdom beyond the scientific method we currently privilege. This perspective alone challenges our assumptions about progress, about what constitutes advancement, about whether newer necessarily means better. Egypt gives us preserved knowledge. Even fragmentary, even encoded in forms we're still learning to read, Egyptian wisdom about astronomy, mathematics, consciousness, architecture, cosmic order continues inspiring investigation. The Great Pyramid stands as mathematical text in stone. The pyramid texts preserve descriptions of dimensional navigation. Temple alignments encode astronomical knowledge. This information survived when libraries burned, when languages died, when civilizations collapsed. It's still there, still accessible, still teaching. Egypt gives us questions, so fundamental mysteries about human capability drive ongoing research. How did they achieve such precision without modern instruments? What enabled their astronomical sophistication? Did they really navigate consciousness dimensions we can't currently access? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're genuine mysteries demanding serious investigation, pushing the boundaries of what we consider possible. Egypt gives us practices. Meditation techniques described in wisdom texts remain effective today. Contemplative traditions they systematize continue producing transformation. Architectural principles incorporating sacred geometry, harmonic proportions, consciousness-affecting designs, these remain applicable. Astronomical observation methods connecting human awareness to cosmic cycles. Consciousness technologies we're rediscovering and validating through modern neuroscience. Practices work regardless of whether we fully understand their original context. Egypt gives us cosmology, a framework for understanding humans as cosmic beings rather than merely terrestrial creatures. We're embedded in vast cycles, processional, stellar, galactic. We participate in universal processes larger than individual lives or civilizations. We're potentially capable of transformation and evolution the Egyptians described as becoming stars. This cosmology offers meaning beyond materialist reduction, purpose beyond survival and reproduction, identity beyond isolated ego. Egypt gives us hope. Knowledge survives catastrophic collapse. The pyramids outlasted the civilization that built them. Fragments of wisdom persisted through dark ages. Human understanding accumulates despite periodic destructions. Consciousness pursues development across all obstacles. When one civilization falls, seeds survive to germinate in the next. This pattern offers hope that our current knowledge, our current development, won't be entirely lost even if our civilization fails. That we're contributing to something larger, something that continues. Egypt gives us ambition. The Pharaohs thought in terms of eternity, built structures meant to last geological timescales, pursued knowledge of cosmic principles operating across millions of years, attempted transformations most humans don't dare imagine, conscious navigation of dimensions, survival of bodily death through skill rather than faith, achievement of stellar existence. They set the bar impossibly high and in doing so expanded what humanity considers worth attempting. They model aspiration beyond mere comfort, security, or survival. Egypt gives us integration, art and science unified, spirituality and mathematics combined, architecture incorporating astronomy, geometry, consciousness technology, symbolic meaning, practical, functional, incoherent vision, daily life embedded in cosmic context. This integration challenges our modern fragmentation, our division of knowledge into isolated domains that don't communicate. Egypt shows that wholeness is possible, that different ways of knowing can support rather than contradict each other. Egypt doesn't give us answers, not final ones, not definitive solutions to the mysteries we've explored. The evidence remains ambiguous enough for multiple interpretations. The monuments keep their secrets. The full extent of pharaonic knowledge and capability remains uncertain, but Egypt gives us better questions, deeper perspectives, richer possibilities, and perhaps most importantly, an invitation to remember that we're more than we think, capable of more than we assume, participants in a story vastly larger than individual lives, the invitation to engage with consciousness as something that can be systematically developed. to recognize ourselves as cosmic beings temporarily inhabiting physical form, to consider that transformation beyond ordinary human limitations might be possible, to take seriously the possibility that we're inheriting unfinished work, that we're the future generation the Pharaohs prepared for, that we have roles to play in a project initiated millennia ago. The invitation stands. The monuments wait. The knowledge persists in stone and symbol and practice. Whether we accept the invitation, whether we receive the gifts being offered, that choice belongs to us. If ancient Egypt offers wisdom worth recovering, the question becomes, how do we access it without falling into either credulous acceptance or dismissive skepticism? How do we engage with knowledge separated from us by 3,000 years of cultural change, linguistic evolution, and paradigm shifts in human consciousness? The foundation is intellectual humility. We must begin by acknowledging what we don't know. Despite centuries of Egyptology, mysteries remain genuinely mysterious. The precision of the pyramids still defies complete explanation. The depth of their astronomical knowledge still surprises researchers. The sophistication of their consciousness practices still challenges our categories. Our frameworks for interpretation, shaped by modern assumptions about ancient capabilities, might be fundamentally limited. The first step toward wisdom is admitting we're students, not experts who've already figured everything out. Direct engagement matters more than second-hand interpretation. Visit the sites when possible. Stand in the king's chamber. Experience the acoustic properties that make the space resonate at frequencies affecting human consciousness. Study original hieroglyphic texts in translation, not just popular summaries. Examine photographs showing the tool marks on granite, the astronomical alignments encoded in architecture, the geometric relationships between monuments. The actual evidence, not someone else's theory about the evidence, becomes your foundation. But understanding ancient Egypt requires more than intellectual analysis. It demands experiential exploration. The Egyptians described meditation techniques designed to expand consciousness beyond ordinary awareness. Try them. They worked with geometric patterns, the flower of life, the golden ratio, sacred proportions believed to carry transformative power. Engage with them directly. They built spaces with specific acoustic properties. Experience how sound behaves in those environments. They marked astronomical alignments connecting earth and sky. Observe those same celestial patterns they deemed significant. Ancient Egyptian wisdom doesn't reveal itself to casual tourists or armchair theorists. It reveals itself to serious students who's willing to invest time, attention, practice, and genuine openness to transformation. This approach requires balancing openness with critical thinking. Be willing to consider radical possibilities, that ancient peoples possessed capabilities we've underestimated, that consciousness operates according to principles we haven't fully mapped, that reality includes dimensions our current science hasn't adequately explored. But demand evidence. Reject claims built on wishful thinking or logical leaps. The sweet spot exists between closed-minded dismissal and uncritical, acceptance-curious skepticism that says, show me, while remaining genuinely willing to be shown. Integration across disciplines becomes essential. Ancient Egypt doesn't fit neatly into archaeology or astronomy or physics or consciousness research. It requires all of them. Study the archaeological evidence. Learn the astronomical knowledge. Understand the mathematical precision. Explore the consciousness practices. Examine the architectural achievements. Read the religious texts. No single field captures the full picture. The Egyptians didn't separate these domains. Their approach was holistic, integrating material and spiritual, scientific and mystical, practical and transcendent. Personal application transforms information into wisdom. The principle of Ma'at-truth, balance, cosmic order offers guidance for daily life. How do your choices align with deeper harmony? The practice of consciousness awareness described in their texts can be cultivated through meditation, presence, attention to inner states. The relationship with cosmic cycles they emphasized can be developed through observing celestial patterns, marking seasonal changes, thinking in time frames that transcend individual urgency. Their long-term perspective building for millennia rather than year challenges our short-term thinking and invites reconsideration of what truly matters. Community enhances understanding. Engage with others exploring these questions. Share insights and critiques. Build collective understanding rather than pursuing isolated theories. The mysteries of Egypt benefit from multiple perspectives, different backgrounds, varied expertise. dialogue refines interpretation, challenges assumptions, prevents echo chambers where speculation becomes certainty. Recognize that understanding develops gradually. Initial interpretations might require revision as deeper engagement reveals layers not apparent in surface investigation. This isn't failure, it's learning. The Egyptians themselves spoke of progressive initiation knowledge revealed in stages to those who proved ready. Approach their wisdom the same way, as a journey rather than a destination, as ongoing practice rather than final achievement. Becoming a student of ancient Egypt means committing to continuous study, practice, and integration, not seeking quick formulas or simple answers, not expecting immediate enlightenment or easy certainty, but genuinely opening yourself to knowledge that might challenge your assumptions, expand your consciousness, and transform your understanding of what humans can be. The question extends beyond individual engagement, though. Humanity collectively faces a choice about how we relate to ancient wisdom traditions and what that relationship means for our future. Every mystery presents a choice. Every unanswered question demands a response, and the questions left by ancient Egypt carved in stone, encoded in geometry, whispered through millennia force us to decide how we'll relate to knowledge that precedes our certainties and challenges our assumptions about what civilization can be. The first option is dismissal. We can continue viewing ancient Egypt through conventional frameworks, treating every mystery as merely evidence of incomplete archaeology rather than potential proof of forgotten capabilities. We can maintain our comfortable assumption that ancients were primitive, that progress moves in one direction, that we've naturally surpassed everything that came before. This path feels safe. It protects our self-image as the pinnacle of human achievement, but it comes with costs we're only beginning to recognize. If ancient civilizations did possess knowledge we've lost about consciousness, about cosmic cycles, about long-term thinking that extends beyond quarterly reports, then dismissal means losing access to wisdom that might address the challenges we face. Climate crisis, meaning crisis, the slow erosion of collective purpose. Perhaps the pharaohs understood something about sustainability, about building systems that endure not for years but for millennia. Dismissal guarantees we'll never know. The second option is equally problematic, romantic projection. We can fantasize about advanced ancient civilizations without demanding evidence, accepting every claim of lost technology and alien intervention, using ancient Egypt as a blank screen onto which we project our desires for something greater than modernity's shallow materialism. This path feels exciting. It offers mysteries without the work of investigation, certainty without the burden of proof. But romantic projection serves neither truth nor wisdom. It discredits genuine questions by association with baseless speculation. It creates division between those recognizing legitimate mysteries and those promoting theories built on wishful thinking. Worse, it prevents actual learning. When we decide in advance what ancient Egypt must have been, we stop listening to what it actually was. The third option is harder but more promising, serious investigation. We can approach ancient Egyptian civilization with both respect and rigor, acknowledging genuine mysteries while demanding evidence, integrating ancient wisdom with modern understanding rather than choosing between them. This path requires intellectual humility, admitting that ancient peoples might have been sophisticated in ways we're only beginning to recognize. It requires patience. Mystery solved too quickly becomes mystery explained away. It requires balancing, neither dismissing nor romanticizing, but engaging with the actual historical reality in all its strangeness and complexity. This choice manifests at every level. Individually, it determines how each person relates to ancient wisdom as irrelevant antiquity, as fantasy fodder, or as legitimate source of insight. Academically, it shapes how institutions approach historical investigation, whether they protect established narratives or pursue truth wherever evidence leads. Civilizationally, it defines how humanity collectively engages with its past, whether we treat previous civilizations as primitive steps toward our enlightenment or as alternative experiments in being human, some of which might have succeeded in ways we haven't. And this choice carries urgency we can no longer ignore. We face challenges, ecological collapse, consciousness fragmentation, existential risks from technologies we've created faster than wisdom to guide them that might require knowledge we've forgotten. The pharaohs obsessed over transformation, over consciousness expansion, over thinking in timescales that dwarf human lifetimes. They built monuments designed to last forever and encoded knowledge they deemed too important to lose. Perhaps they knew something we need to remember, that material technology without corresponding wisdom leads not to transcendence, but to catastrophe. 3,000 years ago, they chose to build for eternity, to preserve knowledge against collapse, to attempt transformation beyond the ordinary. Now it's our turn. What will we choose? The question Egypt asks us is the same question the Pharaohs asked themselves. What will you build that lasts? What knowledge will you preserve? What transformation will you facilitate? What legacy will you create for humans millennia hence who will look back at us as we look back at Egypt? Will they find monuments of wisdom or ruins of hubris? Will they thank us for what we preserved or mourn what we squandered? The invitation remains open. The mysteries endure. The monuments still stand, waiting in the desert, holding their secrets and their challenges, asking every generation the same question: are you ready to remember what you've forgotten? The choice, as always, is ours.